What up, Small Beans fam? How's it going? Michael Swaim here with a couple big announcements and sort of a special extra length episode, or Beanus module as we like to call them. This is a big one. I'm nervous. First and foremost, please, if you've got any love for me or us or the network, give me the next 3 minutes. And then hopefully I'll convince you to give me the next 3 hours and then a little more. So I recently did something I feared I would never do, which is complete my first fantasy sci-fi novel. It's called The Climb. You might have heard me push it before. I've had the PDF available over at the Small Beans Patreon shop for some time, but as of today, the audiobook is now available with yours truly narrating it. It's about 9.5 hours of content for you. And if you've liked any of my fiction at the beginning of episodes of Tales from the Pit, I think you'll really like this. I'm really pleased with how it came out, and it's very meaningful to me. It's been a long time coming. As I say in the intro, I've been working on it in some fashion since I was about 14 years old, so that's about 25 years. I'm going to toss out some reasons I think you might like it. You might like it if you're a fan of the people I consider the inspiration for the piece. It's a bit of Vonnegut, it's a bit Harlan Ellison, it's a little Douglas Adams as opposed to Scott, and there's a little smear of Gabriel Garcia Marquez if you're a magical realism fan. It's a sci-fi fantasy epic memoir, I'm calling it, because it does touch on my experiences with alcoholism and brain damage, and an abusive, toxic marriage that crumbled around me, and my time at Cracked. But you'd barely notice for the most part, because it's mainly about magic and, I don't know, warlocks and robots and stuff, and jokes and meaningful poignancy. There's a big, huge twist about 2/3 of the way through. You won't get there in this sample episode. So if you like big, huge twists, I think that's an incentive there for you. It is very trippy. When I say Harlan Ellison, I mean the trippy stuff. And yet I'm not doing a David Lynch Mulholland Drive. Everything means something. If you've listened to our shows like Coen Brothers or others, you know that I'm a big structuralist and I like symbolism that means something. So hopefully you'll be satisfied in that regard. It does feature at least a dozen very subtle Star Trek references. So anything you think might be an Easter egg about Star Trek probably is. Last but not least, as some of you may have guessed by now, if you've been following my recent Tales from the Pit series on child rearing, my other literal Small Beans announcement is that I'm having one. I'm having a little baby bean. My partner Jen and I are about to enter the second trimester as of this recording. So yes, indeed, after the results of a Twitter and Patreon poll, I decided it would be best for us and our sister network, Gamefully Unemployed, if, like Tom Ryman, I impregnated my wife and produced offspring. So hopefully that'll goose the Patreon numbers. We'll see. We don't know. But really my takeaway is that I have a kid on the way and I'm unemployed outside of Small Beans and some work I'm doing for Cracked and IGN on a freelance basis. So if you want to support my art and you like the 3 hours of book you're about to hear, I encourage you to go to the Patreon shop, patreon.com/smallbeans/shop, and send me $20 to feed my baby. I think I'm about done. We're over 3 minutes in, so I'm just going to end with a couple blurbs from my friends that mean a real lot to me. Robert Brockway read it and said the book is heartbreaking, weird, and very, very funny. And 5-time Emmy-winning senior writer for Last Week Tonight and friend of the pod, Daniel O'Brien, says there's nothing quite like The Climb, a classic, fantastical, epic hero's journey except for the parts where it isn't, a meta-narrative about storytelling and the stories we tell ourselves, a stealth guide to meditation, and a book that's really fucking funny. It's a love poem, it's a dick joke, it's a celebration of art, and a middle finger to those who try to squeeze a buck out of art. It's quite possibly Michael Swaim's masterpiece. So carve a swastika in my forehead. Spike camera. If you don't know what that's a reference to, that was out of left field. Enjoy the free sample. The Climb, or So Far So Good, an epic fantasy memoir by Michael Swaim. This book is dedicated to Jennifer Moore, who wound their way into the story despite my intentions, and to Griffin Rowell, who didn't. Each chapter is meant to function as a poem, joke, or koan, which are three things you get when you shine truth through a prism. Music is another one. Another is mathematics. For the benefit of the dense or impatient, the lessons the author intended you to absorb are revealed throughout. This is the story of a drop of rain that landed in a frying pan and everything that occurred before it returned to being vapor. The first part is called Roots. Chapter 1. If you could sit very still and watch a tree grow from nothing, it would look like a firework. Pulling in energy with its starter roots, it would burst from the soil, thrust upward on a column of wood, and bloom bright and fierce in the sky for only a century or two, before fading again, having sown the requisite dynamite into the ground needed to birth the next volley of green explosions. If you could sit very still and watch a universe grow from nothing, it would look like a tree. It, too, is an explosion already fading. But in the middle, there's a nice long cool period where the universe is just a tree. Just a real dazzler hanging low there in the void. Well, so this book is about a person named Sino, who lived then in that universe at the very bottom of a giant tree just like that, nestled in the roots. And although Sino swam through time and space at a rate that seemed natural to him and those around him, he couldn't help but see things that way, as fireworks. Sino could hear the trees exploding. He could feel the universe already starting to fade. If he focused, he could even watch his own life speed by in its entirety, even smaller than a tree, even shorter. It frightened him. Bang was the sound of a tree's life. Shh was the sound of a person's, even shorter. Shh. Sometimes he didn't even have to focus. The visions just came, time speeding by in a panic. Time didn't actually do that, but Sino was able to feel exactly how he would feel if it did, just by thinking. This was because he possessed an imagination and an associated system of electrochemical impulses in his brain that he used to make judgments and plans. Things he imagined often triggered endocrinal baths that flushed through his bloodstream, a bodily function he perceived as emotions. It didn't much matter if they were real or not, or true or not. Both emotion and imagination are something of a double-edged sword. Imagination allowed Sino to recall or construct a wide range of things in his mind, while emotion added some music to it, an underlying color that was itself a kind of judgment of the thing being imagined or the thought held in mind. Emotion was the flavor, heat radiating from a stovetop you've just burned your hand on. Thoughts came wrapped up in them, automatically it seemed. Sino felt deeply, got caught up in his thoughts and feelings as easily as a fish in a net. Sometimes his brain told him he was the most special person in the world, destined for great things. Sometimes it told him he was as useless as a piece of hammered shit, and dragging everyone he loved down into the mud with him. He would even think, sometimes, that he was as useless as a piece of hammered shit because he thought he was the most special person in the world. Sometimes, Sino's brain told him that when he died, he would live forever as a tiny gray speck of consciousness capable of feeling nothing for all eternity except loneliness. That was a doozy. The trickiest part was, whenever his brain told him that, it seemed just as true as if it were saying, rocks are hard. That's how true this horrible thing seemed to Sino sometimes. Lesson: your thoughts and emotions are rarely in sync with the reality of your situation, but your brain is more than happy to write a fun little story for you afterward to make you think they were. Chapter 2. These unpleasant thoughts would loop and loop, so loud inside his mind that Sino often thought he heard someone behind him speaking them, like an incantation or curse. Despite this, he was still expected to act pretty much reasonably most of the time, and considered responsible for the outcomes of his choices. Go figure. It never mattered much what was going on around Sino either. Ever since an accident he suffered as a child, his outsized feelings and erratic thoughts seemed to come and go of their own accord. They were tidal swells, gargantua, tromping through the jungle inside him. When it got really bad, Sino's feelings could even control what his body did. He would scream and cry and beat himself in the head with the heels of his palms until he left lumps. Sometimes he was so full of the pain attached to the things and thoughts and people around him that he felt like he would dissolve. Sometimes Sino was grateful for the way his brain worked, like when he looked at sunlight glittering off sharp, shallow scallops of water disturbed by the wind, and felt as if he were shining too. He had once found solace in a mate's caress that felt like drilling deep into the ground and drinking the quiet inside until nothing hurt and life was lovely as sleep. Sometimes he felt so sad he wished he had never been born. Sometimes it even felt a little good to feel that sad, which was profoundly confusing. Yet, if you can believe it, Sino had to just keep going on living anyway. Cogitate on that one, Niels Bohr. And that's just emotions. Sino's imagination took him deeper than the quiet in the earth, past the top of the great tree, inside the sun and moon. It could spin stories out of nothing, stoke his longings into bonfires, even make his friends and family laugh and act happy. Naturally, it also fed him detailed visions of pain, sickness, abandonment, and all the other bad things that could happen and which most thinking animals are hardwired to try and avoid. This is what is meant by double-edged sword. Lesson: you take the good, you take the bad, you take them both, and there you have the facts of life. Chapter 3. Even more dangerously, Sino's imagination loved to concoct elaborate plans for the future and whisper promises to him about how life was going to turn out. It did this whether he wanted it to or not. He was just on the cusp of manhood, yet he had already lashed a bevy of expectations to his unfolding self. For starters, he expected to grow up to lead his people. This would have been completely delusional, except for the specific fact that Sino was the son of the person who currently led his people, and in their society, political power was handed down from parent to child. It was still somewhat delusional, because of the specific fact that the prophecy that predicted the course of Sino's life had been broken and twisted in the accident. After that, a proxy child had been fashioned from corn dough by his mother, who could do that sort of thing. It was understood that this other would do the things Sino had been meant to do, make her proud on his behalf, love his soulmate for him and receive their love in return, and so on. Sino also expected to climb the universe. In fact, he hoped to climb higher up the tree than any one of his people ever had, to know the length of it and thereby take measure of the pond he found himself swimming in. He expected, despite the aforementioned accident and the bad thoughts it installed in his head that so often made him feel like a piece of hammered shit, to prove them all wrong someday, to win in the end because he had a good heart. This was pretty delusional, but also something many people believe, so Sino wasn't especially short-sighted in that regard. Lastly, he expected that once he achieved these things, life would cease to be challenging, and he would feel full and content and serene for the rest of his days. Or, failing that, find at least some small measure of lasting happiness. This was completely delusional. So, Sino possessed an imagination, emotions, and expectations. Check. That's already quite a bit to stuff into 8 pounds of electrified meat, but he had other stuff in there too. Here's a brief inventory. He knew he had a soul because it was tortured. He knew he had a dream because it lived in him like a knotted muscle that never numbed. He knew he had a calling because he seemed to do the same sort of things over and over without much to show for it. He knew he had an ego because he mostly thought about himself. Lesson: attachment is the root of suffering, yet it is only through suffering that we grow. Chapter 4. Sino often wondered if these bad shapes in his brain were caused by the accident or were instead an intrinsic part of him. Were these the molecules that made up his core identity? Or was he a lattice of scars born from the damage he'd suffered, doled out at random, meaningless and sterile? Sino didn't know. In most universes, making this kind of distinction is one of the key challenges that faces thinking animals. As if that weren't enough, Sino also wondered about why he wondered, or if he would ever be allowed to stop. He thought so many things at once, it frequently felt as if there were two of him sharing one mind. One of the two just observed, questioning what the other thought and felt, like a live feed with running commentary. Sometimes the commentator was objective, other times abusive. Whatever the case, it always felt crowded in there. Having two of him in his brain allowed Sino to inhabit two states at once, sometimes even contradictory ones. In his mind, Sino was immortal and endless, but also dead and forgotten already. He could never stop working, but always felt lazy. He was both arrogant and self-loathing, found people overwhelming to be around, but ached with loneliness. Contradictions like that are called paradoxes, and are the basic building blocks of every universe. The thinking mind is allergic to them, but the universes themselves can't get enough of these little doozies. Here are some paradoxes common to most realities. Your mind will tell you they can't possibly be true, but this is completely delusional. Attachment is the root of suffering, yet it is only through suffering that we grow. We grow to alleviate suffering. You are only in competition with yourself. This means that winning and losing are functionally the same. The stakes of life are much lower than you think, but if you go around doing whatever you want, you are still a grade A prick. Anything that's ever happened always will have happened, yet is surrounded by so much infinity that it may as well not have. There are things, important things, that you can know and think you understand, but won't really know until gratitude or pain carves them into your skeleton. There are others. Sino collected them. His brain, which was also an organization machine, did everything it could to make sure they itched and gnawed at him. While he was setting fishing nets or climbing boulders or beating himself in the head with the heels of his palms until he left lumps, he'd still be thinking of stuff like that. Lesson: most people think the universe makes sense because it has patterns in it, but the universe owes you no answers. In fact, the universe has some questions of its own. Chapter 5. Here's what Sino was thinking now at the start of the story. Since everything in the universe can only be described through its relationship to everything else, everything in existence implies not just its own opposite, no light without dark, no learning without pain, but also everything else in existence. In other words, the negative space of anything can only be everything else, meaning the universe in its entirety. To say again, in a void, nothing is anything. Therefore, for anything to be something, one must perceive that thing by defining the relationship between it and something else already in existence. So, since everything can only exist if something preceded its existence, then by definition, nothing exists. Everything contains everything, and everything is in this way connected, making the balance a total wash. By encompassing everything, the universe is actually nothing. Like how every step downhill on a hike is a step you have to take uphill again to get back to where you started. Energy is matter is energy, and neither can be created or destroyed, nor does either actually exist, even if we could perceive it directly, which we can't. Everything ends where it begins. Everything. Much of that made sense only to Sino, and some of it was redundant, but that's what it was like being him and thinking about the things his brain thought about, so it's important that you get a taste. Sinnoh could be just lying on his bed watching candlelight dance across the spackled ceiling, but all this wild stuff would be freight training through his head anyway. Try and remember that. A lot of things are about to happen to Sinnoh, and for each and every one that does, there's about 1 million stories and emotions that don't matter attached. Only a fraction of these thoughts and feelings will be mentioned explicitly, and the bulk won't even be implied. After a certain point, the book will concern itself primarily with everything outside Sinnoh instead, although we will check in with his brain again at the end to show character growth. It should also be noted that every other character has a similar carnival going on inside of them too. So yes, granted, you still don't know much about what Sinnoh's body looks like, or the kind of food he eats, or whether this book will feature an innovative magic system, or the level of technology the people represented might employ. This is widely considered a very poor way to start a novel. Lesson: I wish I had done more stuff when I was young, because now I realize being in trouble is a made-up thing. Chapter 6. But listen, the reason it's important to know what went on inside Sinnoh is because that's where he spent most of his time and attention. He really didn't care all that much about things outside himself. He was too caught up in thinking and feeling, and the very important things that he needed to do next. His goal was to make the universe outside his skull match the one inside, which was such a bad plan that it had become the central source of his pain. This might all sound like some kind of crazy nightmare to you. Lucky you. It was all very normal to Sinnoh. That's one of the reasons it's so hard to make ourselves change in a coordinated way. No matter what kind of fucked up situation you grew up in, it feels normal to you. Sinnoh felt like his life was basically a big pile of flaming feces a lot of the time, but that didn't shock him. On the contrary, it felt like the way things were supposed to be. He felt comfortable there, which was part of the reason Sinnoh's brain told him it must be his own fault, being so fucked up like that. Sinnoh wore his dysfunction like a blanket of scabs. Now you know quite a bit about Sinnoh, and hopefully at least one thing to help you make sense of your own universe. Lesson: whatever's normal to you feels like home, even if it is a big pile of flaming feces. Chapter 7. So Sinnoh's first home was in his head, which was a big pile of flaming feces at this point in the story. His second home was his family. The word family describes people who form a sort of team based around the idea that they were once inside the same penis or vagina, or owned said apparatuses. The vagina Sinnoh had come out of belonged to the chief consul of his people, a wise woman indeed, who advised her tribe and was credited for leading them into an era of peace and plenty. Tribe is a word that describes people who form a sort of team based around the idea that they're less likely to get murdered or starve to death if they gather in large numbers. Being the chief's son granted Sinnoh many privileges, which are special things you get that others don't. Of course, everything anyone gets is something others don't, because no two things are exactly alike. This was a deep truth of the universe that Sinnoh had not yet learned, which was funny, considering he was reminded of it whenever his mother and he were in the same room. This was because the chief wore a crown that looked like this: I-I-W-I-I. It consisted of a square piece of wood wrapped in silken cloth the color of fresh blood and splashed with molten gold. On each of its 4 sides, it said I-I-W-I-I. Because the chief thought it was important that her people be reminded of this powerful wisdom whenever they saw her, and from whichever angle. The letters stood for "It is what it is." This is one of the 4 or 5 keys to existence. So really, the ultimate truth was in front of Sinnoh all along, making the adventure he was about to go on to earn that knowledge seemingly pointless. But if you'll recall, one of the truthful paradoxes that forms the fabric of reality is that there are things, important things, that you can know and think you understand, but won't really know until gratitude or pain carves them into your skeleton. In that sense, All the suffering Sino had in store was absolutely necessary. Similarly, it is what it is the overall message of this book, but you can't fully grok what the author means by that without reading the rest. This is how writers trick readers into eating their vegetables. Lesson: there are things, important things, that you can know and think you understand, but won't really know until gratitude or pain carves them into your skeleton. Some of the lessons at the ends of the chapters will be repeats. Repetition is a good way to make something stick, or so goes the logic. Also, a book is quite long, and there are only so many true things one can say. Chapter 8. Because there are only so many true things one can say, the chief devoted herself to saying them in different ways, hoping through exposure to transmit her hard-won wisdom to her people. Instead of "it is what it is," she might say, "it's about the journey, not the destination," or "comparison is the thief of joy," or "attachment is the root of suffering," or "there's no time like the present," or "stop and smell the roses." Despite all she knew, the chief was still fucked up in some ways. Like Sino, she expected a lot from her son, which is just as silly as expecting a lot from the moon. You can expect whatever you want, that doesn't mean it's gonna happen. Nevertheless, when someone expects something hard enough or long enough, it often metastasizes into a prophecy, which is when everyone expects the same important thing to happen because a supernatural being or sign told them so. The chief's prophecy was about Sino, and came from a vision she saw stretched across the night sky when he was just a baby. Since her tribe lived at the base of a giant tree, the chief was only privy to a particular band of that sky, that which fell between the horizon at the bottom and the vast black of the tree's bulk overhead. The trunk, of course, also blocked one whole half of the universe from view. There was still plenty of night sky to be had, but the chief often wondered what the stars looked like on the other side. The tribe's history, woven into tapestries, spoke of a crimson flotilla sent to circumnavigate the trunk 1,000 years ago, and how all that came of it was a lazy stream of red lacquered planks some months later, as if each ship had been painstakingly disassembled and returned. Visions, splayed across the heavens, were not unusual among the chief's people. From time to time they came flitting down between the tree's lowermost branches, themselves unthinkably large like sideways skyscrapers. The visions glowed, gaudy neon and almost massless, manta-like leaves that lilted this way and that as they slalomed down from some unknown bower of dreams above. When they reached a certain level, something in the air made them fizz and explode, briefly filling a large patch of sky with a single image. It was said that those who saw one while alone had their destinies revealed to them. In her long and tragic life, the chief had glimpsed 3 such cryptic messages from the heavens. Most just get one if they're lucky. One particularly cantankerous old villager claims to have seen 7, but was a known liar. The visions the chief saw and took as gospel were these. One day, she would perish valiantly leading her people to safety, as flames as tall as a thrown ball stampeded through the village. A sapling would grow through her ribcage, where her burnt corpse fell, and in time, the people would carve a statue of her from the grown tree, and she would be remembered in this way. Her people would leave the roots and take to the sea, dancing with it for 1,000 generations, becoming something new and gilled. There they would live safely for 1,000,000 years in peace, creating art and loving one another. And finally, she would raise a son, smart and strong, who would climb higher up the tree than anyone ever had and return with secrets to share. She would fill him with her wisdom so he would not need to suffer for it as she had. He would succeed her in time and himself raise many children. Her own great-grandchild's hands would help carve her memorial. What the chief didn't know was that the meanings she ascribed to her visions came from within her, not from the dreams themselves. They reacted to the act of observation, as quantum physics tells us all small things must, and the dreams of thinking animals are very small indeed. In fact, The neon things that fell from the tree almost uniformly showed tantalizing scenes of elaborate success earned by overcoming hardships with pluck and a sort of inherent goodness. This was because the visions had been crafted by beings who had experienced such success through sheer ludicrous chance and attributed it instead to their own hard work and intelligence. In reality, a happy ending is not coming to everyone, nor is a starring role in the latest prophecy. This is readily apparent, but most thinking animals try to forget it as much as they can. None of this stopped Sinnoh's people from believing in the visions, nor should it have. No matter how many times the sun failed to weep rubies on the appointed day, or the great bird Menmini, who is said to sing the stars into the sky each night, failed to envelop the village with her wings and begin an age of sacred darkness, or a wellspring of fresh, clean water that cured all sickness failed to be discovered, each of the people whose vision it was kept a spark of hope, safe and secret inside them, forever waiting to be rekindled. Those dreams drove them on and kept them warm, and sometimes burned them. Lesson: everything you can imagine is real. Picasso said that. Then he painted Guernica, a piece of art designed to rouse images of the foulest rape and murder in the viewer's mind. Good job, Picasso. Chapter 9. Sinnoh's third home was his tribe, the people who lived with and around him. Let's call them humans, even though they weren't. This will make it easier to proceed. In actuality, words like tribe and human are only approximations of what Sinnoh really was, what anyone really is. Words are like horseshoes and hand grenades. Everyone around Sinnoh looked vaguely like him, more like him than, say, a water moccasin or an umbrella. They all had roughly the same color hair and skin that he did, and the same kind of eyes, too. When this happens, it's called a monoculture. Monocultures can be dangerous because you're putting all your proverbial eggs in one civilization basket. For example, an untrue story from history is that Western European people had a monoculture at one time and all planted the exact same kind of potato. When a nasty bug that loved to eat that kind of potato came along, it killed all the potatoes, and many people starved. Central Americans, in contrast, grew thousands of different kinds of potato, and were thus insulated from such a fate. Although, it must be said that 1,000 years later, the typical Western European person enjoys more capital, political power, and luxury than the typical Central American person. Sometimes things look up, sometimes things look down. Lesson: diversity is strength, but you can usually fudge it if you have enough guns and grade A pricks on your side. Chapter 10. The day Sinnoh was supposed to climb the tree and become an adult, the chief came into his room through the open archway, attended by the smell of eucalyptus oil. She ran her eyes across the spackled ceiling, not wanting to look at him directly. "You spackled your ceiling," she said. "I like it." "Careful," said Sinnoh. "It's still wet." "Hey, so listen," said his mother. "You won't be climbing the tree this afternoon with the others." "Oh?" Sinnoh asked, sitting up and placing his bare feet on the floor to pull strength from the earth. He felt unsafe when things happened that he didn't know were going to happen, and this seemed like one of those. There was a charge in the air. "After the accident," said his mother, "I became worried for you, so I fashioned a new child out of corn dough. I've been raising him in the windowless clay dome behind the house, and he'll be climbing in your stead." "I was wondering about that windowless clay dome," said Sinnoh, then laughed to hide his heartbreak, which he often felt obligated to do, even though no one told him to. "When did you find the time?" "When I said I was paying bills, I was actually raising your twin corn brother," said the chief. "In reality, I pay no bills. I am the chief." "But that is not all of it," she continued. "The proxy child will fulfill your prophecy, bring me the pride you were fated to, love your soulmate, and receive their love in return." This was the first Sinnoh was hearing all this. A big wet hunk of spackle plopped onto his head. "I'm sorry," said the chief. "Perhaps I should have told you this all sooner. I didn't want to upset you." The chief wasn't trying to be cruel. They simply believed in telling it like it is, ripping off the Band-Aid. She knew her son would be hurt, and in fact said a number of things to try and lessen his suffering. She even said the right thing, which was that life is a show and everyone gets their own. Since each is entirely unique, it cannot be meaningfully compared to others. Better to simply shut up and watch the show. Easy for you to say, said Sino. Your show made you matriarch of an entire society and magic to boot. My show stinks. Then he ran out, crying and wiping spackle from his eyes. He didn't even hear his mother say she loved him, or that he didn't know her struggle, which was true. All he heard was, "Let's face it, you wouldn't have gotten very far anyhow," which was odd because she hadn't even said that. Climbing the tree was the most important rite of passage in Sino's culture. Up until now, he'd spent the bulk of his days learning from his elders, but after the climb, he would be able to take up a trade and contribute to the community. Being barred from doing so made him a freak, forever stunted, his development arrested. He would always be a child in the eyes of his tribe. Sino ran down a narrow path paved with hexagonal stones, all the while telling himself he was doomed, he was cursed, he was a piece of shit, and so on. He felt his birthright being ripped away like a blanket of scabs, leaving nothing but open wounds. He felt like a Western European person, walking out to their potato field to find bupkis, though he didn't know that. Another thing he didn't know was that this turn of fortune was the first step of a long and fruitful journey. So even though what just happened was kind of good, Sino could only see the bad part, which was a shame. Tears blurred his vision, but his body already knew where he was going. Lesson: it's nice to prepare, but you never really know what's going to happen. In fact, we don't even know enough to tell what's good news and what's bad news. This is not an original thought. A man called Kurt Vonnegut Jr. thought it, and probably someone did even before him. This is the story of a stack of matter that accidentally learned to think and mistakenly assumed it was supposed to do something about that. The second part is called Bark. Chapter 1. Sino ran as fast as he could, feeling the air press on his face and limbs, vibrating with life, miracles booming ceaselessly around him until sheer repetition rendered them mundane. Every structure in the village, even the path he ran on, was painted bright colors or festooned with bolts of patterned cloth woven through with copper thread to celebrate the yearly climb. Instead of resting his attention on any of the dishes in that sumptuous metaphysical and sensory buffet, Sino used the incredible power of his mind to improvise a bunch of shitty stories that made him feel even worse, like rubbing his own nose in it. He was sort of addicted to the bad feelings sometimes, and would compulsively cling to them, even as they electrified his blood until it sizzled. He fueled them with more thoughts, stoked them up like a madman heaping logs onto the bonfire that was once his home. Reflexively, Sino wrapped his entire being around a bundle of memories of the moment his destiny was stripped from him. He conjured the accident and placed himself there. When he was 9, puffed up with the pride of his parentage and confident in his own auspicious future, Sino sneaked off one day at dusk and slipped just around the curve of the tree's trunk, out of sight of the village. There he attempted to climb the tree early and without equipment or oversight, which was strictly forbidden. He hopped from one loop of root to the other, pretending they were wooden sea serpents swimming through the ground, and worked his way methodically up the mountain of wood to where the tree's trunk began in earnest. He gripped its gnarled nodules and wondered at the soft folds at the joining point, like rounded steps, as if the tree had melted slightly into the earth. Sino felt like unhinging his 9-year-old jaw and swallowing his future whole. He wanted it all now. He made it about 30 feet before locking up, which was roughly 1/10 of the way from the ground to the tree's bottommost limbs. Wanting it all now and being able to handle it all now were two different things, and Sino had suddenly become very afraid of being seen and getting into trouble. Getting into trouble was the thing young Sino was most terrified of in the whole entire world. He paused to pound a few shallow breaths into himself and stared straight ahead at the crackle pattern in the bark, trying not to imagine. He just breathed for a while. Then, Sino noticed a strange light from behind and above him turn the brown-gray model to a weird purple, then sickly yellow, then pale blue. He could tell it was descending because every tiny shadow embedded in the crackle rotated upward in unison like trained dancers. He twisted to look over his shoulder. Sino saw a vision. It sliced through the deep of the evening, then hung out right at his altitude, almost perpendicular to the universe tree. This made it look at first like a flat squiggle of neon tubing, curved to suggest the outline of something secret and special reserved just for him. It looked like an open sign. It looked like the meaning of life folded in half. Sino reached for it without thinking, across 20 feet of open air, shifting his balance away from the trunk. There was an itch on the big toe of his left foot. Then he slipped and fell. Lesson: keep your eye on the ball, not the scoreboard. Chapter 2. Falling gave Sino a sweet, sickly feeling, the thrill and terror of improvised flight. All of his organs lifted slightly, no longer needing to press down on one another in a big stack. He was subconsciously reminded of being in the womb before he knew the world could be anything but soft and warm and a serene black beyond black that only the eyeless and those blind from birth can see. He would have surely broken his neck, except that his vision sawed the air just so, positioning itself beneath him and breaking his fall in the manner of a paperweight dropped through a jellyfish. Sino breathed neon. Promises, broken down to their smallest component elements, sucked into his lungs where they burned and zizzed up into his alveoli, capillaries, veins, arteries, heart, the works. Thrashing around inside it, knowing he was about to die, Sino drank and breathed and drowned in his destiny. The dream warped as he grabbed at it, whatever oblique image it had held distending into caricature. Even as his body prepared to become pudding, Sino struggled to see the vision clearly, the bitter realization that he was wrecking it just by touching it rising in his esophagus. It was almost a relief when he slammed into the mud, and a root bashed him in the skull so hard it rendered him unconscious and changed his brain forever, although the root did not mean this as a personal attack. Sino couldn't prove it, but had always suspected that the dream rolled itself up real tight like one of the chief's cigars and crawled into his head through his ear while he slept. He thought this because he could feel it inside him, shouting at him in dayglow, and because he didn't want to think of it as wholly wrecked and gone. Living had been a struggle for him ever since. Of course, he had not known the accident voided the prophesied future his mother saw for him. He had not even known she made a twin of him out of corn dough and raised it to replace him. Sino had always viewed the accident as a defining moment for him, but one of growth. It was a challenge he had bested, a test he had learned from and survived. He had thought his garbled brain and too big feelings were his crosses to bear, the cost he must pay because he was destined for something great. Now he knew that was bullshit. He had fucked it up. He'd been set up for success and squandered it by trying to open his Christmas presents early. He'd gotten greedy, and he was being punished for it. Sino felt a rock in the upper part of his chest grow and grow until he had to breathe differently. It hurt. He didn't blame his mother, though. Some broken things can be fixed, and some need to be replaced. That was just how it was always going to turn out. She was right, in the end, thought Sino. This all made sense. He had always felt like an imposter, but where once he had been an imposter pretending to be special, now he found he easily resigned himself to pretending to be worthless instead. This was for the best, he told himself. It was the part he was born to play. All these things felt crystal clear to Sino, had the ring of truth. In reality, both views of himself were pretend, but he was very far from being able to access that solace. So he ran away instead, incorrectly believing that running away from something increases your distance from it. Actually, the more Sino thought the story of himself he carried around inside, the more it became him. Lesson: we are what we pretend to be, so we must be careful what we pretend to be. This is another line of Vonnegut's. That's okay. We all learn from those that came before, if we're lucky, and try to pass those lessons along again, if we're kind. Chapter 3. There he was, a fly trapped in the amber of the moment. He'd been born a certain person at a certain place and time, and he hadn't been consulted about any of it. Sino bade his feet move, and the universe passed by around him. His slice of it, anyway. Since his universe was shaped like a giant tree, and his people lived at the bottom of it, that slice was necessarily located under its branches, which extended out into the distance farther than the eye could see or anyone in living memory had explored. This meant they never experienced rain as you know it, or snow, or hail, or a thunderstorm, but they did experience visions that fell from the heavens, and other things too. They got great quantities of water that would suddenly sheet down the trunk and flood the village as if the universe were weeping. Every once in a while, a whole limb would let go and fall to earth, crushing a huge swath of land like a meteor strike. In exchange, Sino and his people got access to soil and earth, extremely rare commodities in this story. They grew crops in abundance to feed themselves and their animals, and the surplus they traded to caravans of tall, grasshopper-like men in armor who descended from above riding trained spiders and offering all manner of trinkets and metal tools alien to them. They were pale and gaunt and hungry-looking, and despite regular trade, there was no consistent line of communication between the two peoples. When the chief asked if they might arrange transport for an emissary to their nation, they only recited the same passage in an untranslatable chitter and lowered their heads in apparent shame. Sino's tribe did occasionally send ambassadors to other villages at ground level and hosted some in return, but going up tree remained the culture's great source of mystery and frontier. This was because it was the nature of the universe tree that climbing down it erased any memories accrued while climbing up. The spider riders could carry knowledge of Sino's tribe back home with them, but never share what was above the lower branches, even if they wanted to. They lost their own memories and even their language when they descended to the ground, which is why they only chittered and thus had no real hope of ever communicating. Instead, they had to be handled by their trained mounts, who were raised from birth to be able to count goods and make change. The system actually worked fairly well. There are very few who would try to shortchange a giant spider. This kept the crucial stream of food that grows in soil flowing to the higher reaches of the tree. Some of the climbers from Sino's village never returned. Others retained vague memories of incredible quests and strange creatures, none provable. A few carried artifacts from their journey, but never an understanding of where they got it or its importance. Sometimes they even brought back thick binders full of instructions they'd written themselves, but invariably they held only page after page of gibberish. It seemed life simply didn't allow for starting over. So it's only natural that climbing the tree became a preoccupation and rite of passage for the folks on the ground. They'd been sending expeditions up tree since time immemorial, using bare hands and feet at first, then stone hatchets, and finally pitons and spiked shoes and ropes that they pulled up behind them as they went. Now, 1,466,281 pitons, most of iron, some of bronze, adorned the entirety of the wall of wood that formed the village's backdrop. When one of them attempted a climb, they used the pitons of their ancestors and brought as many of their own as they could carry in a shoulder bag. In this way, each generation built on the climbs of the previous one and got a little higher, and presumably saw a little more. Fragmented legends were the spoils they brought back with them, and these became woven into their own history in due time. Highlights: a roving band of beings with fur all over their bodies, able to spring from limb to limb with incredible grace, clad in rags and trailing smoke. They carried tubes that projected pain at a distance and made a sound like a femur cracking. A network of limbs so wide and compact that a village, much like Sinnoh's, was built into trenches, indents, and hollows carved into the flesh of the tree. The people there spoke in hushed tones of even stranger things above, steel serpents that swallowed many people at once to carry them from place to place, and fist-sized flies that fed on the sap of the tree and turned it into a poison light they emitted from their rumps. A hole in the side of the tree, so large it could have swallowed the Chrysler Building. Decades prior, one woman was said to have stepped into it and been sucked up and away by a sudden wind. Her scream is still heard in the hours between midnight and dawn during the coldest parts of the year, when there is little to weigh sound down. This universe's sky also held a sun, which trees need to thrive. It orbited around and around the trunk at a great distance, shining on all the people on one side of the tree, then the other. During the day, the pitons in the bark shone like a field of stars in a dark brown sky. At night, that half of the world was black and starless. On some level, the people of the roots felt that absence and longed for constellations they'd never known and couldn't name. Whether each star circled a great tree, or a great owl, or a great kazoo, who can say? Sinnoh arrived at a place he returned to often, in person as well as in his mind, the site of the accident. This was perhaps not the very best place in the whole world he could have gone at the moment, but he was drawn inexorably, still holding tight to that pain. He found the spot where the brackish water met a tangle of thin roots and squatted down on them. They bowed under his weight, held him there like a fish in a net, or like the sky holds the sun. He felt just as hot, too. Sinnoh focused on calming his body. He closed his eyes and felt the weight of his clothes on his skin, then the weight of his flesh on his bones, then the weight of his bones on his soul. His soul felt too hot to touch. Instinctively, he pried it apart from himself despite the burned fingers, strived not to become it. He pushed it out onto the surface of the water instead. When he opened his eyes, he saw his reflection there, where he had temporarily stored his soul so that it wouldn't burn him up. "Fuck," it said. Its arms were crossed over its chest. Sinnoh's arms were limp at his sides. "I know," said Sinnoh. "Believe me, I know." Both Sinnohs felt like the whole universe had no choice but to fall apart around them, shatter like crystal, fade to black, and that's adios. It didn't, though. It just stayed there being a fucking tree. Lesson: life finds a way. Unlike the previous lesson, this is a guaranteed bona fide original thought for which the author takes full credit. Chapter 4. When Sinnoh had an episode, it felt like vomiting and sounded like the clack of a roller coaster cresting a rise. He had so little control over it sometimes, it felt like an out-of-body experience, this time even more than usual. He opened his eyes wide, muscles soaking in the chemical need to run or fight. A million thoughts marched through his mind like ants and carried away bits of stuff he thought he knew. He arched his brows hard, paced in a little circle, stuck his arms straight down like his fists were iron and the ground a magnet. All through his limbs, he was so tight and hot that he shook. Sinnoh was trapped between hating himself and hating everything else, squeezed between the urge to live and the desperate need to never have existed in the first place. Without consciously forming the words, His mouth started to voice the shit his brain was talking. He projected the spew at his reflection in the water, which still stood impassively regarding him with a pitying expression and arms akimbo. "You piece of shit," he barked, not even sure who or what he was talking to. "You should be dead. You should be fucking dead." He didn't even believe this, per se. It was just the vomit coming out. "You're disgusting. You're nothing. Fuck you. Fuck you." Stuff like that. He felt alone and rejected, and his brain's survival strategy was to feed him thoughts that would make him feel even more alone and rejected. Sino screamed until his abdomen ached from the clench, until the veins on his neck stood rigid and his face was beet red. He pounded on his temples with the heels of his palms. It felt like he had to do that, or the whole stupid process would never end. So he hit himself as hard as he could, wanting it to end sooner. Although whether he was trying to shake demons loose or punish himself for his own failings, he was never quite sure. Sino realized in a detached way that his twin wore its heart on the outside, which in this moment he found grotesque. "You're fucking grotesque," he said as a result. This proved to be the last straw. The Sino in the water was fed up with being abused. In one decisive motion, it grabbed the roots at the edge of the shore and heaved itself up and onto dry land. As it stood, its ripples resolved, its flatnesses became roundnesses, and water shed from it like rain off polytetrafluoroethylene. The second Sino emerged from not being like a snake shedding its skin. He even looked a little bigger, maybe half an inch or so. "Please stop yelling horrible stuff at me," he said. Famous Ray's original Sino instantly collapsed in the face of this objectively reasonable request. He was too overwhelmed with emotion to experience much shock, even though a living reflection was something he'd never seen nor heard tell of. Instead, his whole body just slumped, like a broken scarecrow nailed to a crossbar. All the energy that had so recently fueled his rage and disappointment and throbbing need converted at once into learned helplessness. He felt compelled to prove his lack of worth to this new being, in the hopes that it might someday forgive him for being so pathetic. Sino tried to say, "I'm sorry," instead said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, fuck, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, I don't know, fuck, oh God, I'm sorry, I get it, I'm a piece of shit, right? I'm a piece of shit, you're totally right, please don't be mad at me." "I didn't say anything like that," said his reflection. "I just asked if we could have a civil conversation." "I'm sorry," said Sino. "You're so right, I'm a fucking animal, self-centered animal, can't even listen right." "Sure you can," said Sino. "I mean, you could. Hey, and listen to this. We're climbing the tree, bucko, and I mean to the top. We're going to see the whole universe and love all of it. It's why we were created. It's all there is. But there was an accident and my fate was twisted, and now the chief raised a child of corn dough to take my place," said Sino. "Yeah, none of that matters," said Sino. Then he sighed. "Look, if you're not going to do it, I will." "I don't think you're allowed to," said Sino. "Like to see you try and stop me," said Sino. We should pause here to recognize something incredible. In the midst of all of this, hidden from himself, hidden even from the other Sino, locked away in a corner of the part of his brain that wrote and maintained the story of himself, our hero was already writing out the hopeful version. Now fateless, a flushed turd let loose in the wide-open sewer of the world, part of him still entertained the fantasy that life might yet deliver him to the place the prophecy had named, or at least somewhere interesting. He didn't dare share this spark of hope with anyone yet, least of all Sino, either Sino. It had to be shielded from the elements if it was to survive. This was one good mental instinct Sino had, one of the few. The fact that any human develops any healthy mental instincts at all is what's incredible. So it's important to note the ones we do find knocking around our toolboxes. Lesson: most people would do anything to keep from being alone, even if they have to rip themselves in half. Chapter 5. Eventually, as they always did, even though his brain told him they never would, the bad chemicals in Sino's blood started to collect and curdle in his stomach and lose a little of their effect. This made enough space inside him for shock, so he became that for a while. To be clear, although there are many things in Sino's world that do not mirror your own, a reflection hopping out of the water and making demands on your courtesy was not one of them. He was just as surprised as you would be, which might go halfway to explaining why he suddenly reached out and pulled the taller one into a bear hug. "What do you think you're doing?" yelped the hug receiver, yanking his arms up so as not to be pinioned. His feet started slipping on the tangle of roots. "You're part of me," said Sino. "We belong together. Get back in here." Stuff like that. "But I don't want to be," said Sino. "The pain's too much, man. I'm moving out, and that's that." Stuff like that. Sino's reflection tried to pry himself loose, and the hug evolved into a struggle, then a wrestling match. The taller one kept slipping loose, then the shorter one would flail and grasp again until he found something to latch onto and become an anchor. Finally, the Sino made of water let out an inhuman noise, and the heart set at the center of his chest flashed so brightly that regular Sino had to cover his eyes with his hands or be blinded. The creature swiftly wrapped around him, losing its shape and solidity. Sino felt a crushing coil of his own selfness hoist him upright. Then a piston of water forced his mouth and nose open, burned through his sinus cavities, and filled his lungs. For someone who only a few minutes ago thought he wanted to not exist, Sino sure was scared of dying. Not only that, he was scared he was about to lose an important piece of himself, even if he didn't die. He had just experienced something impossible, and it seemed the impossible something was now being stolen from him. He guessed it was probably his soul. Sino became unconscious, which he already was in the mindfulness sense. Lesson: just because something's never happened before, that doesn't mean it won't now. This is fine, or at the very least unavoidable. This is the story of the stories we tell ourselves to try and make things better, whatever that means. The third part is called Trunk. Chapter 1. Sino awoke in the same spot to the feel of roots on his back and sound of lapping water. His soul was gone. With it had gone the vision dream in his head and all the electricity that had been propelling him through life so far. He was calm, in a bad way. Parts of his brain that were open to joy had closed for business, indefinitely perhaps. Nothing hurt, because nothing felt like anything, which hurt badly. Sino got to his feet, wishing someone was there with him, a voice at least, to say something appropriate or helpful. But there was no voice. He was alone. When he arrived back home, everyone seemed astonished to see him. It was explained that someone looking exactly like Sino had run into town just after they lost sight of the last climber, loudly declared his vow to outclimb the proxy child made of corn dough, and sprang up the tree before anyone could stop him. He hadn't even taken along a satchel of pitons, which each climber smelted themselves over the course of their last year of childhood. Instead, he yanked out the pitons behind him as he climbed, collecting them for use further up. This was considered the highest sacrilege. To remove a piton planted by a forebear was to steal history from the entire community. There was no reason this disgrace should be Sino's to shoulder. If one twin commits a crime, the other is not held to account. If someone dresses up as Spider-Man only to terrorize the city, this is not, strictly speaking, Spider-Man's fault. But Sino felt guilty anyway, which you probably could have guessed. He knelt under the weight of obligation. Tears he thought he could no longer cry loosed themselves and hurtled to the ground from sheer heaviness rather than feeling. They made little puffs of dust as they hit. Barely able to speak for shame, Sino explained what had happened in quiet segments of a few words at a time. To keep the story from grinding to a halt, everyone believed him right away, even though a living water demon taking the form of a person and stealing their soul was outside their collective experience. So the chief consul met with her advisors, and it was decided that despite some misgivings, her fragile, beautiful son was to be let in on the tribe's greatest secret, that the tree was dying. She hadn't wanted to tell Sino that, but now it seemed the situation demanded it. This was also the real reason she hadn't wanted him to climb the tree, but it looked like he was about to get that chance, and she doubted he would fail to act on it. That meant that 3 Sinos would be going up the tree, where she had expected only 1. Lesson: change is the only constant. Chapter 2. Sudden change brought up strong feelings of anxiety and sadness in the chief, but she had practiced knowing what to do about it, and so she did. She held the sensation in mind at a reasonable distance without attaching any untrue stories to it, and waited for it to go away on its own. She could do that sort of thing. In truth, this was a magic just as strong as that which could knead life into corn dough, and she wished she could teach it to Sino. It was the sort of magic that took root in your bowels over a matter of years and filled with iron, but which never left the confines of your own body, and so could not be shared or imparted. With it, she could observe her own mindscape, gauge the shape and color of her feelings, even dig through them to understand the pigments and crosswinds that conspired to make them that color and shape in the first place. Thus, it was with mixed emotions that she invited Sino into the longhouse where important things like this were done. He walked slowly to the far end of the great hall and became encircled by his mother and her advisors, themselves ensconced in the glow of a single candelabra standing at the back of the chamber. Sino didn't look at the tapestries on the walls, embroidered with silver thread, which chronicled the history of the rootlings through abstract ideograms, a dead language as alien to them now as an interstellar spaceship. Such is the rate at which thinking animals change. He didn't look at the humped half-columns running the length of the space, cylinders worn smooth at their tops through the mere act of touching them for luck a billion times. Such is the rate at which thinking animals require luck. He didn't look at the amber sap that wept through a wall of moss behind the council. The back wall of the longhouse was, in fact, the trunk of the universe tree. Taps pulled sap from it day and night and guided it into raked grooves in the floor, from which it would be collected and diluted, then administered as an anesthetic. Such is the rate at which thinking animals need surcease from pain. He didn't look at their clothes or their body language or their facial expressions. He kept his eyes down. Sino's mother tried to speak, but only a sorrowful croak came out, so one of her people stepped forward instead. "The omens are not good, beloved son of our tribe," they said. The chief nodded through her tears. The advisor then listed the omens, so Sino would understand just how bad they were. Only 7 grains of rice fell through the holy sieve, and an odd number of them were red. The eldest of us drank of the sap and found the taste bitter. That night they dreamed of a calf's head split open by a flat rock. The flower we planted at the edge of the water died, while the scorpion we clipped the pincers from lived a week before it starved. 8 days, actually, added another advisor. "Oh, forgive me, that's right," said the first. "Plus your mother has the shits." When the list of bad omens hit Sino, he felt like he was being stoned by the entire village. He figured they were all about him, all his fault. Even though that doesn't sound egotistical at first, it is, which is why he kept looking down, so they would know how much pain he was in and maybe someone would help him. This was in fact the only way Sino knew how to ask for help, which wasn't his fault. "What does it mean, Mother?" he asked. Wiping snot away from her dignified upper lip, his mother the chief said, "It means change, which is all there is. It means nothing, which makes up most of this place. Nothing is coming, my son. In your lifetime, I fear, if not in mine, and it's time we face it. Lesson: from the loftiest chief consul to the lowliest serf, none among us may choose the time or place they get the shits. Even Abraham Lincoln, even Muhammad Ali, even Taylor Swift. Chapter 3. The council further explained that the ones who tended to the universe tree's roots, who mulched their tops and mounded soil and planted saplings like tiny replicas of creation itself, who sowed furrows with food that grew high and plump off the nutrients that nourished existence, had sensed a trembling. The ones who spoke to the wood heard the word rot drift through their minds so slowly it took a day to resolve. Although no one could be sure what kind of tricks the universe would pull next, the chief and her advisors took these things to mean that the tree was sick, possibly dying. Whether anything could be done about it remained to be seen, but Sinnoh's people tended to adopt a humble attitude toward life's vagaries. They expected they couldn't do much that would sway the fate of the universe one way or the other. Sinnoh secretly disagreed, as all young people do. He looked up. He felt a perfect orb of heat appear behind his face in response to the staging, the symbolism of his mother looking down at him, all of them looking down at him. Surely the one who built the longhouse knew how it would make you feel. Was that the point of it? How mean, thought Sinnoh. Water demon is a new one, said the chief. I'll give you that. What does it mean? I don't know, said the chief. I have to get it back, don't I? The piece that ran away. I don't know, said the chief. Does this mean my prophecy is true, or is this a new fate? Is my fate what I make of it, or predetermined, or is it all just random? I don't know, said the chief. Well, what do you know? Asked her son. I know that if the universe tree is in pain, it's our duty as its children to at least try to help. I know you've sought a way to be important to the tribe, a path to follow. I know that it was your soul, no one else's, that disappeared up the tree as if foreshadowing your own climb. I know that climb will be difficult, and that you will be questing for more than just height and a name. And I know that all things end. Trees, childhood, parenthood, the universe. If you cannot forestall that eventuality, perhaps it is your destiny simply to witness it. Can't the corn dough kid do it? Sinnoh asked. This was a little joke to lighten the mood. It didn't. No, said the chief. After all that has happened, I decided to crush him back into a ball. He's just a palmful now. It was fairly traumatic since he so reminded me of you. This didn't lighten the mood either. I'm sorry, said Sinnoh. I thought more would come of that. I thought more would come of many things, but thoughts are just thoughts. Easy come, easy go. Mostly the latter. Why is it like that? His mother made a motion with her shoulder and stamped her bauxite staff once on the ground. The eldest stepped forward. They were the last of a defunct order of blind monks who claimed to use an enhanced sense of touch to sand wood into the shapes it wants to be, often nightstands, figurines, and other saleable collectibles. Sinnoh had known them his whole life, but he flinched now, scared of what they represented, which was the promise of the unknown, the thing that thinking animals fear and covet most. The eldest reached into their ceremonial muumuu and withdrew a stack of 5 planks of wood connected on 3 sides by waxed cloth and hempen ropes. We have gathered some of the tribe's most powerful and magical relics to aid you, said the chief. You will carry them with you up the great tree in this trunk, which was waxed with the tallow of a bull killed mid-orgasm and bound by cloth from my own crown. The eldest released the bottom board and it gave in to gravity, unfolding the whole thing like a Jacob's ladder to create 4 enclosed spaces to be used as shelves. Straps on the back made it possible to wear like a pack, and ties on the open side kept everything from falling out. Sinnoh also had 4 enclosed spaces he would carry up the tree. They pumped blood through his body, suffusing him with oxygen so he could keep on living. His heart and the trunk would prove equally vital in the years and decades to come. Lesson: vessels are usually valued for what they carry more than for their own sake. Similarly, some people only care about you because of what you can do for them. Forgive, forgive, forgive. Not because it's fair, but because it will bring you the peace you deserve at long last. Chapter 4. Incidentally, your body probably feels like a vessel for your thoughts, but it isn't. In reality, your body is the thing itself, and it's your thoughts that are immaterial. This is readily apparent, but repugnant to your brain, so it's hard to really believe it. What you can do is listen to your body more. Sino didn't listen to his body, yet. He lived in the future, the past, and his head and heart. So automatically, unconsciously, as he reached for the proffered strap and settled the lightness of the empty trunk onto his back, Sino opened his mouth and let his brain talk for him, giving voice to its ramblings in real time without filter or observation, like watching a stock ticker unspool. His brain asked one question for each of the places that he lived, each of the spaces in his heart and pack. For the future. But what do I do when I find my soul? For the past. Does this mean my prophecy was true after all? For his head. Even if I do find my soul, how do you know that will help the universe tree? For his heart. Do you really think I can do it? Each time he asked a question, he was answered by one of the elders stepping around him and placing an item in its preordained place in his collapsible trunk. In silence and with wizened hands that showed blue veins in the shapes of bones, they equipped him with a small inventory of answers. First, a smooth stone, almost featureless. The chief said, "This is the first stone the water creature touched when he stepped onto shore. He is connected to it, as we all are to our firsts and lasts. It will guide you to him." Second was a key of dark red wood polished to a shine and composed of 3 dovetailed pieces. The chief said, "When you were born, this was found in the afterbirth. We don't know what it does, but I figured you ought to have it." Third, a delicate lattice of roots carefully extracted by hand and suspended in crystallized sap from a peach tree. They were mottled with orange. The chief said, "This is a preserved sample of diseased roots. Perhaps showing it to those further up tree will prove fruitful. We have heard of powerful machines that, though lifeless, can nevertheless perform magic of their own. Seek them out." Last, a lump wrapped in leaf was lovingly placed into Sino's hands. He unwrapped it to find a dense ball of corn dough inside. The chief said, "I don't think you can do it, son. I know you can do it. I mean, you could. I love you a priori, just because you are you. I know we're asking you to do something very difficult, but even if you fail, I'll still love you. I know your brain makes you think otherwise, and I'm sorry for that. I wish I could take it away, but I can't. Now please eat your brother quickly. I have to go have the shits some more." With his eyes watering, Sino ate the little ball piece by piece, pinching off bits of it with his fingers and shoving them into his mouth. It smelled like his own unwashed smell, but it tasted sweet. As he choked it down, his mother explained why, and also wept. By reclaiming him, she said, "You reclaim your destiny, and destiny is a corridor with no branches. Your will is no longer free. From now on, you'll never know if the things you choose to do are your idea or the corn's. Your life will feel just the same, but even though you'll try not to think about it, you'll still wonder what the corn kid is doing in there from time to time. Trust me." When he was done, Sino wiped his hands, then yanked on 2 extra bits of rope attached to the fronts of his straps. The trunk cinched up so that his 3 remaining boons were held in place. It felt pretty empty, as did he. The chief rushed forward, hugged him for 30 seconds, then turned on her heel and nearly jogged out of the room. If you could feel how badly she had to defecate, you would appreciate what an act of love it was for her to hug Sino even that long. She was a good mother, but only human, so there was only so much she could do to prepare her child for life. In truth, it wasn't a lot, but hopefully just enough. Just enough is plenty. Lesson. Look, the wooden key is nothing. Not everything is something. I write kind of stream of consciousness, so don't believe everything you read. If you must have an explanation, feel free to think of it as a simple instance of quantum uncertainty spontaneously altering placental matter at the Newtonian level in a manner so astoundingly unlikely, it hardens into a shape that happens to mimic that of a man-made key. Done. That's that. Forgotten. Chapter 5. Sino wasn't even mentally present during his mother's parting hug, which was a shame. Instead, he was focused on trying to imagine the end of the universe tree and what might lay beyond. His brain only fed him the same old story of himself as a tiny gray speck of consciousness capable of feeling nothing for all of eternity except loneliness, which was also a shame. His legs were rubber as he slinked out of the hall. In reality, there is no end to the universe, because whatever comes before or after it, or can be said to sit outside or around it, is, in the end, just more universe. Still, the desolation the chief and Sino both foresaw in that moment was typical of thinking animals faced with a whole heap of uncertainty, and the fear that they shared didn't need to be taught. It would have been easily recognized by Ronald McDonald, Satchmo, or a frightened rabbit. Lesson. There are things, important things, that you can know and think you understand, but won't really know until gratitude or pain carves them into your skeleton. There are other things that you can just hear about and get the gist. The end of the universe is one of those. Chapter 6. Guts soaked in fear chemicals, Sino set out at once to the base of the tree, bringing with him only the backpack, which he had filled with a change of clothes, a meal, a blanket, and a water skin. He wore a leather climbing rig that had iron rings sewn into the shoulders and around his waist, places to loop long pieces of strong, thin rope. There was also a glass tube in a wireframe cage sewn into the leather on his right outer thigh. Glass partitions of different thicknesses separated the tube into cells, and the topmost chamber was filled with a liquid metal derived by heating certain rocks and condensing the gases released. All climbers wore one. By responding to small changes in air pressure, the delicate partitions in the tube would shatter in sequence, roughly tracking how high Sino had climbed, since he likely wouldn't remember if and when he returned. The wire cage was there so that a climber couldn't easily tamper with their own results. Sino's tube had 12 chambers in it. The most a climber had ever burst was 4. And that was it. He hoped to catch up to his missing piece before it got too far, and besides, he didn't want the whole village to see him. He didn't want them to see if he fell, and he didn't want them to see if he succeeded either. It made him uncomfortable to be special. Sino wanted to be special, but also not special at the same time. Or else he wanted everyone to be special, which they were, but he didn't know that yet. He wanted life to be fair and kind, which it isn't, and he knew that already. When he got to the base of the tree, the whole village was there. They all waved at him in eerie unison, or at least that's what it felt like to Sino. Many of them smiled, but he reasoned that was because they felt sorry for him or were happy to see him go, or wanted to watch him fall and break his legs, or wanted the chief to see them smiling at her son. He felt deposed. Nevertheless, because we all have many voices inside us, he felt excitement too. The pitons at the very bottom of the tree were misshapen with age and fat with rust, easy to put your weight on and feel secure. They held Sino in a tentative climbing pose, inches above the dirt, belly brushing the trunk, nose close, smelling dust and splinters. He tried to put the villagers out of his mind. even though he could feel his mother watching him with some sense that humans have no proper name for. "Okay," he shouted over his shoulder. "I'll be back." After a bit, he added, "Thank you all for coming." It seemed like the thing to say. Then Sino made a conscious mental effort to change the lens through which he viewed the stuff currently happening to him. His hopeful part dared to dream that this was an opportunity to wrest control of his fate away from the claws of a twisted prophecy and write it himself. Maybe his life wasn't a story that went in an order. Maybe it was a bunch of scattered moments, thrown on the playroom floor and kicked around with no particular goal in mind. Pieces you could build with. This was a new way of viewing things for Sino. The thinking mind is able to view the same things very differently from one moment to the next. Before the accident, Sino had thought his life would be a non-stop victory lap, and things basically seemed to be headed in that direction. Afterward, he thought his life was probably going to stink more than a dead cat on the side of the highway, and things basically seemed to be headed in that direction. Now he changed course again. The funny thing is, if he'd taken a moment to notice this about himself, Sino might well have realized that his experience of life was wholly determined not by what happened to him, but by how he related to it. Once he had been the chief's son and destined to succeed, so he strived to meet that expectation in spite of all his hardships. Then he was expected to fail, and found he easily adopted the view that he had not survived the accident, that it had shattered him irrevocably and made him weak and shameful. Sino was coming from a place where all the challenges he'd triumphed over in the past had now become red flags, spreading cracks in the foundation. As he hoisted himself up another foot, he imagined repainting those flags, or forgetting them, smashing them to dust and turning them to triumphs again. Sunshine in the eyes of his people warmed his back and urged him upward. Within 2 hours, he'd reached the bottom of the lowermost branch, around which were carved steps and handholds left by the generations of climbers before him. Their help would diminish as he ascended, but here the invisible hand of his ancestors could still be felt. There was even a small platform levered into the side called the final resting place. Sino eased himself onto it and let his muscles recover while he ate. He would sleep there tonight and trusted that the universe would provide more food up tree. He hoped that his soul also needed to sleep and eat, or at least needed something that it had to slow down to acquire. It had certainly felt like it needed a lot of things when it was inside him. Sino looked down. Trained to climb from birth, he lacked any serious fear of heights, but he still worried about soreness and slippage and what he would do when the pitons ran out. The villagers had returned to their lives. He watched the tiny clockwork world of people and structures get homogenized by shadow as the sun disappeared around the sweep of trunk to his left. The air became cool and told his skin to become cool too, so he wrapped himself in the blanket. Out beyond the roots and the swamp and the shore, the ocean was a perfectly level gunmetal parking lot. It darkened along with the sky until both met at black and merged to erase the horizon. Sino found this calming and slept. Lesson: thinking animals are adept at rewriting what just happened to mean what we want it to, or need it to, or fear it might. The same thing can mean the opposite tomorrow. They're just stories. This is a big one. This will come up again later. Chapter 7. When Sino awoke, things were not calming. 4 grasshopper-like people in rusty pitted armor looked down at him as if he were a pothole that needed filling. 2 leaned on halberds with gray and green checked banners flapping from them. Another held Sino's cloth trunk in its lower left hand. Their eyes were orbs of a gelatinous material at the ends of flesh-colored stalks extending from their faces, which were otherwise vaguely similar to Sino's people's, at least enough to read an expression from. They had the mouth parts of a praying mantis and no noses, which is why the chief could sometimes get away with trading them old produce. More concerning, Sinnoh felt cotton against every part of his exposed skin. This, coupled with a haze across his vision and a snug feeling, told him he had been cocooned in a spider's web, which made sense given the hairy legs the size of palm trees he could just make out through the gauze. Sinnoh found he was paralyzed as well. Cool! Things were falling into place. All of this realizing happened in the space of about 6 seconds, since the brain works on a more flexible timescale than the universe does. It was time enough for Sinnoh to shut his eyes again and pretend to be asleep, which seemed prudent. Even though he had episodes and cried a lot and felt scared a lot, Sinnoh found a strange focus usually descended on him in life-threatening situations. It was as if his body didn't know what was really dangerous and what wasn't. Even though most of the time that pained him like an air bubble in his aorta, right now it allowed him to keep calm and make some quick deductions. He had been poisoned, either by spider or spear point, and moved from his perch up to the top of one of the branches, out of sight of the village. He was absolutely about to be killed or enslaved. His climb was over. His people failed. He likely held the new record for shortest climb, although no one would ever know it, which was probably for the best. And the universe was doomed. Actually, only 3 of those 5 things were true, but that's not bad for 8 pounds of electrified meat, groggy and working overtime. Of course, he had no way to act on any of this information. Even though he thought about his own death a lot, Sinnoh still found it hard to imagine himself actually dying, to accept that it was really happening now. He figured he'd better start, though. So Sinnoh practiced that while the gaunt men trundled him into the waiting limbs of their spider, who had many more than 8, if we're being honest, and was only really similar to a spider, but not one precisely. Lesson: the brain is a powerful electrochemical engine. It can take you far, quickly, and in many different directions. Accordingly, be careful where you point that thing. This is the story of a frightened rabbit. The 4th part is called Limbs. Chapter 1. The rock in the trunk started talking to Sinnoh after about 20 minutes of travel. The feeling of swaying suspended from the behemoth as it picked its way from limb to limb was dizzying, and the edges of Sinnoh's focus were giving way to dread and panic. Thanks to the spider's toxin, he couldn't even hyperventilate, so he just panicked right there in his mind where no one could hear or help him. In fact, he basically had a whole entire episode tucked away in there, like his body in the cocoon, like his mind in his body, like his soul in his mind. It wasn't the very best feeling ever. And maybe that's why the rock seemed to start talking. Or maybe the rock really did. It would take some years for Sinnoh to sort that one out, since he never could get a fix on exactly how crazy he was, or what it meant to be crazy, or how other people felt from the inside. Anyhow, "It is I, the talking rock," said the talking rock. "Behold me in my munificence." Sinnoh tried to answer out loud, but the effort only vibrated his larynx ever so slightly and pushed air through his still lips, making a flatulent hoarse sound. The voice in his mind seemed to intuit what he had been trying to say. "Munificence means unusually generous, as I unassailably am." "Are you my soul, somehow speaking to me through the stone?" Sinnoh thought said. He tried to think of a less clumsy way to describe what was happening than thought said. "No," said the rock. "I am merely an echo, and an echolocator," it added, throwing the line away. "What does that mean?" said Sinnoh. "Not the definition," he said, interrupting a loud psychic inhalation from the stone. "I meant, what do you locate?" "The other one is a dozen stories ahead of you. Although he does not sleep, he fears traveling by day, lest he evaporate." "Oh, I see. The other one, "Well, can you help me escape from this cocoon? 'Cause otherwise I don't think it really matters how far behind I am at this point. I am not sentient and have memorized this introductory message by rote. It cannot be repeated. Thank you for using Talking Rock." "But shh," said the rock, and went so silent Sinnoh knew the conversation was over. He didn't understand why at first, but then he opened his eyes to find they had stopped, and that one of the carapist things had pulled his head near to its own. They perused him with interest, each eye stalk working independently to cover more ground at once. To Sinnoh's surprise, the being also muttered to itself, but instead of the insectoid chittering he associated with them, sounds that were clearly a language made of words came out. They shifted their mandibles out of the way to reveal pink muscle lining a humanoid throat. The sound was melodic and hung in the air, more like a nursery rhyme than a song. Although he had no idea what it intended, something in the thing's bearing made Sinnoh realize he must have also spoken out loud. That was probably why it was looking at him, and it also probably meant that the paralysis was starting to wear off. Sinnoh tried to wiggle his limbs and felt a few muscles half clench, but it was hard to tell how mobile he was wrapped up like that. His captor said another little ditty, louder this time, and the spider slipped a filament the breadth of a hair and strong as steel between two vertebrae at the top of Sinnoh's spinal cord, then let fly with another dose of paralytic. Lesson: God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change. Chapter 2. Sinnoh perceived a multiplication of the layers of sound around him. Sounds of distant conversation, scraping footsteps, hammer and nail. They were approaching a place where the limbs were thicker and the armored people made cities of wood and iron. Eventually, he was cut loose from the spider and was instead carried by his 4 traveling companions. There was a change of air pressure and temperature as shadow enveloped them. He was indoors. Finally, about an hour after waking on the first morning of his quest to save the universe, Sinnoh was deposited in a smoothed wooden cubby, cut from his webbing, and left alone until he could move again. While he waited, he tried to reach out to the rock with his mind, but nothing happened. They had left Sinnoh his leather suit, although the blanket he'd been wrapped in was ruined forever by a thick paste of webby residue. He discarded it and stood. His legs did not wobble. He felt clean and clear in his mind, almost empty in a way he rarely was. He found his feet led him out of the dim chamber toward the warm light of the only exit. Part of him wondered if it was the corn dough kid doing it. Following the light took Sinnoh around a bend into a small but proper library, which was something he had never seen before. Sinnoh's people used scrolls and tablets more than books, but here were 5 walls lined with more books than he'd ever seen in his life, perfectly sharp-cornered and of every color dye can produce. The room was bounded by walls of wood, the most abundant resource at this level of the tree. The only furniture, besides bookshelves, was a wooden desk and 2 wooden chairs on an area rug the color of spilled wine. Metal things Sinnoh didn't recognize sat on the desk, and windows on the opposite wall admitted daylight through thin curtains. A door opened between 2 bookcases, and someone came in. They were tall and gaunt and carapaced, but they looked different than the ones who'd brought him here. They wore some kind of symbol on a rope, different clothing over their armor, and a woven net of silver chains over the back and top of their head like a glittering spider web. Chains reached from the edge of the net and held the person's mandibles forcibly open, so that their softer throat was always exposed. It looked painful to Sinnoh, and the way the chains dug grooves into each mouthpart made it clear that they'd been there a long time. "Oh, I'm sorry," said the creature in Sinnoh's own language, while the hole at the back of their throat winked and stretched itself into acrobatic shapes. "I just stepped out for a moment. I'm supposed to be here when you come in." They extended a gauntlet, and Sinnoh warily shook it. Nothing bad happened, at least not immediately. The thing bent, lifted Sinnoh's backpack from behind the desk, and extended that at him too. It looked to be unaltered, so he pulled it toward himself with both hands and cradled it into his chest like a baby. "You can understand me?" he said. "Oh, you bet," said Arlo. "My name's Arlo. I'm the caseworker who's been assigned to manage your orientation." Lesson: even things that are very different can often come to a mutual understanding, at least enough to stop scaring the bejesus out of each other. Chapter 3. After some cajoling and a little time for his body to stop tingling with fear, Sino reluctantly agreed that he did sort of recognize the crest on Arlo's breastplate. It was a red sun behind a white swoop, like the foam at the top of a wave. The paint was chipped and flaking. Later, Sino would learn that the crests were not actually painted on, but a natural expression of the creative vibrations of the person inside the armor, and thus unique to each individual. That this one was starting to shed meant Arlo was very old indeed. "That's because you've seen it before. I've been visiting your people as part of the trade caravans for many years. It's only recently I decided to make the leap over to acclimation." He clasped two of his arms behind his back and paced. The floor creaked and bowed slightly with his weight, reminding Sino that the building he was in, the entire civilization around him, was suspended in the air. It was rare, but not unheard of, for one of these people to fall screaming from above and bury in the mud at rootling level. Every so often, something even stranger would fall all the way down to the village, huge and mangled. "What's acclimation?" said Sino, then cutting Arlo off. "Not the definition, I mean in this context." "Ah, we aid you, the climbers. After all, you've been sending people up to us for as long as we've had a recorded history. We'd like to maintain good relations with our neighbors." "Oh," Sino furrowed his brow. Arlo, who had become adept at reading mammalian facial expressions, said, "Ooh, not what you expected?" "Not really," said Sino. "To be honest, I expected to have to go it alone. Venture bravely into the wilderness." "Yeah, we get that a lot," said Arlo. "You only have to climb if you want to, and that'll be after you graduate, which is a long way off." "Graduate?" "Or you can kill some time, see the sights, and head back home. Of course, nothing is forced on you." "I thought I was captured." "Sorry for that. Not many have the inclination to learn a foreign language, so it was decided the safest way to acclimate climbers was for our interceptor teams to simply bag 'em and drag 'em, as we say, and not attempt to communicate themselves." Sino hadn't even thought to wonder how Arlo spoke his mother tongue, and was too embarrassed to ask now. It was amazing, even to him, how easily he fell into the role of a student or supplicant. All he seemed to want was someone to tell him what to do, even as he resented it. Someone to tell him he was doing good. It could be his mother, a bug, a rock, anyone. Again, sensing his confusion, Arlo answered the unspoken question. "Acclimators are suspended in a cage made of branches, far enough above your village so as to remain unnoticed, but close enough for your words to reach us. My people can hear from a much further remove than yours." Sino silently imagined himself in that position for a few moments, which is called empathy, which is a skill, which means that it takes practice. After practicing empathy for a moment, Sino looked up and said, "But you would have lost your memories of home, yeah? That must have been scary, to be in a cage in the air and not know why." "Yes, it is," said Arlo. "I spent 2 months hanging there. Food and water periodically lowered to me. A vessel for my waste exchanged and sent up. I assumed I was being punished for some terrible crime. Learning to understand your speech was an afterthought, something to pass the time." A shadow came over his face, and his stalks retracted, eyes becoming oily, flat black pools. "Those memories I kept, once they retrieved me." Arlo availed himself of the bookshelves all around and stacked some on the desk. Each book he pulled was one of a set, materials to be given to each new arrival. Sino had never seen multiple copies of the same book all exactly alike. "It's a sort of rite of passage for some of our people, and one I volunteered for so I could serve the function I am now." Arlo slammed down a thick tome bound in rough cloth. He placed a thin yellow envelope on top of that, then a folio of clear plastic pages with bright patterns hand-painted on each. Sino unwound his arms and rested his portable trunk on the desk next to the stack. The last of his fear drained out of him, replaced by lonely ache. "It was indeed harrowing," said Arlo, "but worth it, I think, to better relations between our people." They then clasped the edge of the desk with all four arms and leaned forward at a steep angle, bringing their mouthparts close to Sino's face. Their breath smelled like ice and torn mint leaves. "And now," they said, "you're going to return the favor." The rock spoke again in Sino's mind. It said, "The other one is now 15 stories ahead of you." Lesson: before you declare something the wild frontier and go exploring, it's polite to find out whether people already live there. They might even show you the ropes if you aren't a grade A prick. Chapter 4. Sino asked more questions as Arlo led him down several rounded corridors to a set of big wooden doors inlaid with ornate leaves and fruit of wrought iron, shapes Sino did not know iron could make. "So no one actually climbs the tree? It's all a lie?" "Absolutely not," said Arlo. "Some continue on in their time, and we aid them as best we can when they pass through again on their return journey. But it's true that many of your people do end their climb here, just as some of our people seek to go up the tree themselves." "Why don't our altimeters show that?" asked Sino. "We've developed a way to tamper with them, so we can set your climb height to whatever you'd like, and send you back down with a head full of mystery." "But that's cheating." "If a rootling cheats in the woods but doesn't remember it, does it make a sound?" "I can't do that, though," said Sino. "I'm on a particular quest, not just climbing generally. I'd be betraying my people and myself if I gave up now." "Ah, and here you are, being lowered in a cage to find yourself among aliens. Welcome, Sino, welcome." Arlo pushed hard on the right door and it swung open, a curtain rising on a dream. Despite his fear, despite his brain that was always saying so many things at once, Sino's mind and body were both struck still for a blessed moment, and he was briefly rendered open and receptive to taking in the new world around him. The way he looked at it made it gorgeous and exhilarating. It went like this. They stood near the trunk, at the base of a limb that diminished to a point in the distance so far away it was invisible. Crowded rows of houses, open-air stalls, and what looked like a cathedral studded the length of it, forming a wide path down the middle. They had wooden bones, but each structure was also plated with tin sheets held in place by iron nails, and some of the stalls featured turning mechanical parts Sino couldn't surmise the function of. Afternoon sun bounced off all the metal and shone dully gold. Wooden bridges strung on woven iron cables connected this limb to others on the left and right, while wooden ramps, stairways, and ladders carried people up and down to various levels like ants on a woodpile. Smaller limbs supported cozy little neighborhoods, while larger ones seemed to be devoted to markets and shops. Along with the people, spiders climbed freely between branches and across cables, treating the whole thing like one big web. Some were covered in cilia, some shiny as a beetle, others faintly glowing from an organ that shone through veil-thin skin. None of them were incomprehensible to behold or impossible to describe. They were just weird. Sino preferred the land animals he was used to. The universe had no preference. Steam and smoke commingled everywhere. There was the smell of old meat being cooked over open flame. Sino's eyes stung. Arlo put a bony hand to his back and urged him forward. As they walked, Arlo explained many things. He explained that he was taking Sino to an education center where others of his village were learning Clicktong, the local language. This would enable them to work an apprenticeship, should they so choose, which would in turn set them on the path to earning passage further up tree. They explained that one couldn't simply climb, since their people routinely cleared out any pitons they found above a certain level and melted them down to make nails. There were rules. There was a system. It would take time. But he wouldn't be alone in it. He would be supported. Sino absorbed about half of this information, but eventually came back to himself enough that their patter took on the shape of a discussion rather than a lecture, which suited Arlo just fine. They discussed the fact that Arlo's armor was part of his body and not clothing. This was when Sino learned that. They discussed the neon dreams that fell from above, and Arlo promised he would learn much more about them in time. They discussed things Arlo wanted to know about life on the ground, what it felt like to always be solid, to never worry about falling, to have a closer relationship with the sea. They discussed farming, which Arlo's people did attempt in hollowed-out spaces carved into the wood, but they had much less luck at than Sino's did. Here, they mostly grew moss to brew into tea and meaty mushrooms they cooked over open flame. They discussed animal husbandry, which the Limb folk did not at all, relying entirely on trade with those below for meat, milk, and so on. Even eggs were hard to find, since spiders ate most of the birds. They discussed how both their names were 2 syllables and ended in O, and whether that might mean anything. Maybe. That depends on whether they invest the idea with meaning or connect it to other thoughts, which is how meaning works. Things don't have it until a thinking animal gives it to them. They didn't discuss that, it's just true. A large dormitory hall, painted blue and white, approached the pair and deposited itself before them. "This is where I leave you," said Arlo, "in the capable hands of my colleagues. They'll get you a meal and a bed, and you'll start school in the morning, if you're amenable." "Thank you," said Sino. "If that's the way up the tree, I guess I'd better give it a try." "Wonderful," said Arlo. "And don't let the proctors get you down. If you have any last questions for me, now would be the time." Sino shifted the blades of his upper back. His backpack was back in its place, now much heavier for the books added to its store. One question did linger, looping in his brain. He said it out loud to try and pry it out of there, but he didn't really expect an answer. "And what of the stone?" he said. "Why doth it speak to me?" "I have no idea what you're talking about," said Arlo. For the first time since meeting Arlo, Sino once again felt alone and unsafe, unsure of the borders of magic and science, or his reality and another. It was a real Michigan J. Frog type situation. "Never mind, then," he smiled. "It was a joke. I guess you have to be a rootling to get it." He hurried up the steps and into the building, hiding tears without knowing why. None of this was mandatory, but Sino went along with it because everyone around him seemed to be going along with it. This works on most people in most situations. Lesson: Google the Milgram experiment. Chapter 5. In the time he spent with the Limb folk, Sino found himself hiding tears a lot, along with his terrors and the voice from a rock that spoke so often in his head now that he wondered if it were really coming from the stone at all. At first, he was afraid to share those pieces of himself, being as a minnow tossed into what, for all it knew, was a shark tank frothing with blood. Later, he was simply ashamed, in a familiar way that almost made it seem like home had caught up with him and begun to take root. Naturally, he also felt ashamed for feeling more comfortable, since he knew he was supposed to be swimming upstream all the time. Once or twice, he even considered going home the easy way, by leaping from a limb. "The other one is 27 stories ahead of you," the rock would say, cheerily waking him with a tone as clear in his mind when it was on his nightstand as it was when he hid it under a floorboard. Nothing muffled the sound, and yet no one else heard it. It seemed to delight in rousing Sino well before sunrise, leaving him tired and tight. Sino arose and sat in bed in the dark in a long open room that smelled of cedar and sweat. His sheets were scratchy from being cleaned thoroughly many times between owners. The stone was near. Above and around him, 7 others slumbered in bunks, all climbers from his village. Their names were Jubal, Harlan, Skeeve, Buendia, Ford, Unk, and Captain Jean-Luc Picard of the Federation Starship Enterprise, who Sino only thought of in those terms because he always insisted on saying the full thing. He hadn't told any of them about his quest, or shown them the poisoned roots or the stone, and none of them asked because they had all left the village before him and didn't want to embarrass the son of the chief consul. Unk and Jubal had even seen Sino's spirit pass through on its way further up, but they didn't connect the event to him. He hid. Even though Sino hid, he wasn't unpopular. The others wanted to know or even impress him, and he oscillated between enjoying the feeling of connection and being overwhelmed by it, or by the openness it seemed to demand. As we've discussed, his brain mostly told him that his insides were gross garbage, so he felt it would be impolite to leave them strewn all over the shared space. Instead, he'd let a little of the stink out at his regular check-ins with Arlo, through glances and downcast eyes, body language a counselor of his own species would have been sensitive to. It was enough to notice, but Arlo didn't, which was enough to make Sino know for sure that he was alone, and no one would help him even if they seemed nice and it was their job. Sino fell into the cycle of studenthood, days spent learning Lim tongue and about the culture and people around him, so he could make an informed decision about the next chapter of his life. He recited a poem from home, but with the new words under his breath as he dressed. Like his sheets, his clothes were loaned and mid-comfortable. Everything was loaned, everything provided. Where Sino had expected to find an untamed wilderness to traverse, he found instead that the path before him had been explored already, was settled, even paved long before his birth. It would all be fine. You just had to do it a certain way. Breakfast. A rotation of potato hashes fortified with chopped meat scraps, onions, and tomatoes, and gussied up with an overpowering number of spices. The other one is 40 stories ahead of you. Morning session. Language skills in a clapboard room with two of his fellow climbers. They were taught in small groups, many of them being at different stages of their education. There were no grades or demarcations, so everyone learned as fast as they wanted to. Sino was a quick study, especially when it came to languages, and had already zoomed past many of his peers. He could read Lim tongue easily now, and the class therefore doubled as a crash course in the history, religion, culture, folklore, and practices of these people. The other one is 96 stories ahead of you. Lunch. Sandwiches, always. The Lim folk seemed very proud of having the ability to mill wheat and make rye bread. Although bread like that was not commonly eaten among Sino's tribe, he still tired of it and pined for a good piece of corn cake, but not that corn cake, or flatbread made from cassava. He developed the theory that they had to chop up all their food and mix it with spices because they either didn't know how to cook properly or couldn't keep the produce from below fresh long enough to make it to market. Because the human body is like a biological machine, these small changes in Sino's diet in turn affected the mix of chemicals in his bloodstream and signals from his brain in ways impossible to predict. Oh well. The other one is 1,507 stories ahead of you. Afternoon session. Arlo would sit on the edge of the bed across from Sino's with his hands clasped thoughtfully at his backwards jointed knees and ask if everything was going all right. Sino liked Arlo, but it never went much deeper than that. The rest of the day, and 3 days a week besides, they were encouraged to freely explore the city. They were adults, after all. They had proved that just by coming this far. The other one is very far ahead of you. Lesson. Look for the helpers, but Pobity's nerfect. Chapter 6. Sino repeated this loop many times for the same reasons some of the lessons in this book appear repeatedly. Knowledge accrues like silt and is as easily washed away, which is as it should be. Like school in your universe, and like most books, the truly relevant information could be crunched down to a few bullet points. This is true in the other direction too, though. Any subject sufficiently paid attention to unfolds to reveal the entire universe. This is because everything in the universe can't help but be connected to everything else, just like Sino was attaching to the people around him now. He couldn't feel it, didn't want it, but that didn't stop it from happening. At night, they breathed each other's breath. Here's what Sino learned by the time he graduated, and how each thing fucked him up worse than he already was. Number 1. The Limfolk population dwarfed that of his village, and they categorized their people along 2 axes, what they did for a living and how wealthy they were. These they called guilds or castes. They were difficult words for Sino to learn because the concepts had never occurred to him before. This fucked him up because now that he knew they existed, he would inevitably begin to see people through that lens, on top of any others he'd accrued, until they got so distorted he couldn't really see them at all. Number 2. Soon, he would have to decide whether to join a guild and take up a trade, head up tree himself without the safety and support the Limfolk promised, or have Arlo tamper with his climbing gauge and go back down with a head full of nothing. This fucked him up because, for someone with as many conflicting voices in his head as Sino, a big decision like this is its own kind of web. He'd be stuck in it forever, always thinking what could have been if he'd chosen differently. Number 3. Limfolk valued industry, faith, and loyalty, in that order. They didn't much care about public health, cleanliness, or running out of metal to smith, even though the amount that could be found in the soil held in the boughs of the universe tree had to be limited, surely. Sino learned these things from their stories and from walking around. Those are 2 good ways. The third one is talking to people, but he wasn't ready for that yet. He found he enjoyed the stories. They all seemed to mean 2 things at once, like a fish standing in for happiness. The stories he was used to just said true things. This fucked him up because a culture that doesn't value public health harms all of its citizens. A culture that values reactive interventions over preemptive care also has a long way to go. Number 4. The only religion here was uppish. Much like Sino's culture, Limfolk were born into a universe where things started at the top and bounced downward, bestowing luck or destruction on those below like a pachinko machine. Like Sino's culture, they figured this meant the good stuff was probably somewhere up there. The difference was, while the rootlings saw the climb as a way to test courage, for these people it was a holy crusade. In the distant past, whole armies had been sent up tree to pillage and conquer. Nowadays, they made polite inquiries and dispatched research teams, and the drunk ones sang rousing songs about a land of light and love they were one day destined to subdue. This fucked Sino up because, coming from a monoculture, he had rarely had reason to doubt the existence of his gods. Now when he prayed to them to please come find him when he's dead and alone and a little gray speck, he had a new voice in his head that told him he was really just talking to himself, which made him feel like he already was those things. Number 5. Because they had sent so many up the tree, and because so many had failed to return or else rained down dead, filling the safety webs above the town with so many corpses it shrouded them in artificial night, travel upward was now strictly regulated by the uppish church. The timber cathedral was their seat of both government and worship, a massive edifice carved into the trunk and studded with stained glass windows depicting the icon of their faith, a golden crosspiece broken in 2 and meeting at the top to form an up arrow. Their leader, the tree pope, taught them that once their god had come among them in mortal form and broken a limb above their head thus, and declared that their people had fallen from grace and must stop at nothing to reach the canopy and reclaim it for divinity. Until they did, they would live in sin and spiritual pain, born tainted and worthless. This one fucked Sino up in a way that's kind of self-evident. No one likes to hear that the ultimate truth of the universe is that they're tainted and worthless. Number 6. After a certain point, the talking rock would only say, "The other one is very far ahead of you." That was the only information it could provide. This one fucked Sino up because duh, obviously. And that's 6 things. For 3 months of school, that's actually pretty good. Lesson. Opinions are like assholes. They expand or contract to fit any load of shit you need them to. Chapter 7. As previously mentioned, Sino spent most of his free time walking around and looking around, both to avoid awkward conversations with his roommates and to test the geographical limits of his telepathic connection to the talking rock, which so far seemed to be infinite. Lessons concluded, his meetings with Arlo tapered off, and he was left with the rare feeling of creeping up on a decision he knew was momentous ahead of time. If this were a movie instead of a book, this part would be a montage. Here are the top 10 things Sino experienced and learned from whilst walking around and doing other things. Number 10. Your guild was usually painted onto the chest plate of your carapace, like the weathered one with the swoop and sun Arlo wore. Climbers who decided to apprentice wore their guild crest on a rope around their necks. Number 9. No one here seemed concerned about the tree, and no one he'd shown the diseased roots to saw them as anything but a curiosity. 2 limb folk had tried to purchase them from him, and at least one spider thing hissed at him in a way he also, upon reflection, interpreted as a potential offer to buy. Sino kept his rotten roots hidden after that. Number 8. By apprenticing for a year, climbers earned the right to ascend to the next level of the tree swiftly and safely via a divine elevator that could only be accessed with written approval from the tree pope. At the end of that year, they were invited to stay and assimilate, return home, or move along up tree. Sino even learned how they handled the disoriented folks climbing back down, shedding their memories as they descended, knowing only their home and their need to get there. Most climbers the village sent up either ended their journeys here or else were humanely corralled, paralyzed, and trucked back to the final resting place. Number 7. He got drunk at a tavern several times because he found it sometimes made looping thoughts dull and withdraw a bit into the darkness, away from the spotlight of his mind. He was also able to converse with his friends from the village that way, even come off charming, although he drank so much on those occasions he rarely remembered them afterward. Number 6. One of those nights, and this night he remembered, he had sex with one of the limb folk. In case your imagination has habituated, please recall that these are rusty armored medieval mantis people. Let's cut the crap, that's what they are. Number 5. That was how Sino first learned that their armor was neither skin nor clothing, but something in between. He realized in that moment, as they both undressed in a sharp slant of blue moonlight, that he had never seen one naked before. Naked, Sino's lover looked like a shelled shrimp stood on end, glistening blue and with the head of a snail. Then they fucked. Number 4. Later they talked in bed, and Sino learned that their children wore artificial armor fashioned from shed spider shell until they developed armor of their own. It was considered a part of their body, but also a treasured personal possession. He also learned about himself, specifically that he couldn't really enjoy sex with a stranger. When she dressed again, Sino saw the light beamed through a keyhole in her heart. If he had asked about it, she would have let him look inside and he would have understood her more. But he didn't. So he didn't. Number 3. The next day, one of the other rootlings asked him what it was like to have sex with limb folk, so Sino stopped talking to all 6 of them. He mentally detached completely, never to consider them again as a matter of self-preservation. Inside, this felt like ripping off chunks of himself, like the uppish messiah snapping their branches. His stomach hurt all the time. He realized his roots had intermingled with theirs after all, but he realized it too late, so he only felt the pain of the severance and had let the joy of company slip by. He would graduate in a week, and he still had no idea what to do next, or even where he would sleep once they kicked him out of the dorms. Number 2. Now he had no shell, no home. He thought about how the limb folk must endure great suffering to construct their carapaces, built up bit by bit through constant irritation. They faced life's horror with stoicism. This made Sino's struggle pathetic. He had been sheltered, coddled, and now he was a shelled shrimp with a hole in his stomach and no armor to speak of. Sino wished he had been born a limb folk. Here were a people who felt pain, dealt with it, and didn't make it anyone else's problem. Trying to do the same, he sneaked off somewhere dark and around the bend to hit himself in the head and make himself vomit and grunt through clenched teeth that he was sorry for being such a worthless piece of shit. Number 1. The other one was very far ahead of him. Lesson: different people deal with pain differently. This is the story of how art will save your soul, if you let it. The 5th part is called Branches. Chapter 1. 2 days before he had to choose his own adventure, Sino was led to a public square, precariously slung between 4 boughs and supported by spiderweb woven through with tin, which doesn't bend smoothly and therefore glittered in the sun at its many corners. There, he and one other graduating climber were assaulted with information about all different kinds of labor he might do to cleanse himself of the taint of sin. There were young limb folk there, too, their armor soft and still forming into plates, eye stalks on a swivel. The hosts of each stall took a great deal more interest in them, but were happy enough to give these 2 interlopers the gist in bursts of clipped chatter and wet smacks tendoned by snatches of melody. There were the building trades, like smithing, carpentry, and branch maintenance /testing /reinforcement. There were the service trades, like cleaning, shopkeeping, and branch pruning /extermination /fumigation. There was academia and the sciences, although climbers from below were politely barred from this path. There was the uppish church and government work. Climbers couldn't do that either. The thought that someone from the ground might help shape the laws and beliefs of the people of the limbs was like ipecac syrup to them. You couldn't train spiders either, or be a limb warden, which was what they called the people that captured Sino and brought him here in the first place. That was fine with him. You could stomp wine. You could fix shoes, you could sew clothes, you could use molten lead to form stained glass shards into mosaic windows, you could shovel shit. Lastly, squatting in a shadow like an afterthought was a wooden booth splintered with reuse and canting distinctly to the left. An old person sat on the other side, dozing. Their armor was green with oxidation, their guild crest almost completely worn away. Nevertheless, Sino could tell what it had once been, an amorphous blob of neon rainbow. His breath caught in his chest. "Excuse me," he said in a series of tentative clicks and whistles. Today was the first time he'd tried to speak limb tongue outside of school. The ancient armor flexed slightly, and the person's eyes went from milky to black again. "You don't want to do this, rootling. Move along." They repositioned a spider wax candle to weigh down some parchment on the desk and returned to a state of repose. It was a sign-up sheet with some names already on it. At the top it said, "Story Fishers, Apprentice Level." "What does it mean?" asked Sino. Without looking up, the old one said, "It's how we get you primitives to want to go up the tree so bad. It's how we get labor out of you, you know. It's why you're here." "Oh, awesome. I'd love to know why I'm here. Are climbers allowed to apprentice?" "Sure, if you don't mind betraying your own people. Most decline." "If it's so exploitative, why are you telling me?" "I'm old. I don't give a shit. You'll forget when you go back home anyway." The ancient grasshopper blew a raspberry at Sino, although how that was functionally pulled off he couldn't say. The only other rootling in the place spat on the ground and flushed red. You mean those visions that drift down to us? You make those? That's just a scam? They aren't visions, kid. They're just stories. Fuck you, said the kid, which was extremely difficult to do in limb tongue. I'd rather shovel shit. Sino waited for them to disappear into the crowd completely before adding his name to the list. Lesson. Sometimes, to betray your community is to honor yourself. Is something that a lot of people who are about to betray their community probably say. Chapter 2. Sino never spoke to another person from his village again for the rest of his whole entire life. In the fullness of time, the 6 he had known in school would all choose to shovel shit for a living and happily thrive in that noble endeavor until their fare was paid and they disappeared up tree like wood smoke. They didn't make their work their identities. They lived for the weekend. Some of Sino's options disappeared too. At night, curled up on a straw mat in his room at the back of the stitching house, he would imagine he was walking on a limb that got thinner as it went, branching in different directions. Each time he chose a branch to go down, the others fell out of sight. He agonized over every decision he'd ever made and how he could have made it differently. What might have happened then? Meanwhile, millions of fresh decisions whizzed by right under his nose, and he kept right on making them without even noticing. He just tucked them away to ferment into regrets at a later date. He had episodes a lot, but always at night, and he hid the sounds by putting straw all over his head before hitting it. He wore a really cool hat to hide the lumps. One of those nights, so like all the others, Sino admitted to himself that he would climb no higher, but that he couldn't return home in shame either. So, he reasoned, this would be his life, now and forever. He thought about all the other lives he could have had, and measured them against this one. This one didn't come out at the very top, to say the least, but he let it wash over and become him anyway. This is called a state of learned helplessness, and it was a tool Sino relied on a lot. Lesson. Dreams are bait. Bait is real, but it functions differently than you thought it would. Chapter 3. During the day, Sino climbed several ladders to where the branches thinned, many levels above the town's tallest rooftop. That was where the spiders wove a net designed to catch the neon visions that fell from above. His job was to gather them and stack them on a big wooden platform, then lower them down with a rope and pulley to where another apprentice could receive them and drag the pile to the cutter. This process captured 99% of the dreams. While the sight was a rare and precious portent to the villagers below, the limbs were lousy with miracles, and its people had ceased to be in awe of them long ago. They saw the visions only as pretty lies. Chum to be chopped up and sent drifting down to entice the rootlings into sending their young people up tree to work for the limb folks' benefit. Indeed, at this height, the neon things lacked some of the radiance and intangibility Sino knew. Instead, they were silky to the touch and able to be delicately handled. They glowed, but the light pulsed and faded like labored breathing. Here was the system. Catch all the dreams, then drag them to the cutter to be dismembered into story beats, saving only the most tantalizing visions. Suture those into a coherent pattern at the stitching house, leave them in the sun to heal until their glow is nearly blinding again, then release them from the lower limbs. The nice thing was the most effective story patterns had already been figured out, so stitching them together was more akin to following a recipe than playing jazz. The limb folk called it fishing because that didn't sound as cruel as butchering a miracle to gaslight another culture into indentured servitude. In their society, it was considered a shameful but necessary evil, as the nation quickly industrialized. They consoled themselves by limiting the exploitation to a year a climber, which they considered highly humane. Incidentally, it was the practice of processing divine mysteries into banality that caused the limb folk to evolve their armor. Life can be especially painful when you know that dreams are fake from an early age. Some added resiliency is required, and for them this came in the form of a carapace of cynicism and irony. They kept darkness at bay with a shield instead of a light. These qualities made the Limb folk great at darkly pointed social commentary, but terrible at family-friendly musical reviews. Lesson: comparison is the thief of joy. On the macro level, this means that if you're too busy trying to gauge whether your day is going well, you won't have the capacity to enjoy it even if it is. On the micro level, this means that every moment you encounter is absolutely unique and unlike any other, even if it feels like yesterday's beans. Strength and love flow from everything around us at a rate our electrified meat can't even process, so we're forced to take most of it for granted. This is another way of saying it is what it is. Chapter 4. Sino may have lost all sense of connection to his own people, except the guilt and shame of letting them down, which would forever chain him to the earth, but in time he found a new community among the other story fishers. He worked his way from the webs to the dragger teams, then from the cutters to the stitching house, where he hoped to wait out the remainder of his year, and met others who shared that ambition. The wounded places where Sino's roots had been ripped from the people who looked like him and grew up where he did, reached out and intertwined with the roots of these aliens because they were all fascinated by the same task, turning chunks of pure dream into stories compelling enough to inspire. They formed a team not around whose genitals led to their creation, but rather a big decision they had all made about what they would spend most of their time alive doing. By his 5th year working there, Sino had 3 close friends, including a girlfriend, all Limb folk. No one from his class had chosen to assimilate but him. When he saw his girlfriend without her armor on, it seemed to him the keyhole in her heart had taken on the shape of his silhouette, so he cut a hole in his own heart shaped like her. Fleeting moments of happiness shared between them were bound together by long stretches of retreating into himself, lest she see his ugliness, or worry and shame tap dancing so loud in his head that he couldn't focus much, let alone enjoy what there was to enjoy. She had never seen him have an episode, and he didn't tell her about hitting himself in the head or the little gray speck all alone for eternity. With great effort, Sino had been able to keep those parts hidden so far, all the while knowing it couldn't last forever. He even stuffed thoughts of climbing and quests and orange rot and the end of the universe deep down inside himself, as if to make it the corn dough kid's problem. He chopped down the great tree in his mind. As far as Sino was concerned, it stopped at the limbs. To maintain this pretty lie, Sino scrupulously avoided meeting any new climbers from below, or attending the ascension ceremonies of those who moved up and on to better things. He ignored the talking rock as best he could, just as he ignored the spreading gossip about the rootlings and their dire warnings of a looming apocalypse. He accepted that his soul was forever beyond his reach. He tried not to care about that, but it was a hard thing to not care about. But sometimes it was the opposite, because Sino was addicted to paradox. The whole rest of the tree he pretended wasn't there would call to him, pain him like a phantom limb, a little stronger every day. His childhood dream of reaching the top, of knowing the unknowable, a dream he now knew definitively had been sewn together from scraps by a professional cynic, dared him to achieve it anyway. Sino ignored it all. He focused on nailing his patterns instead, and so did his friends. Even if he couldn't touch them or tell them how much he loved them, it was nice to all be pulling in the same direction. He would have liked to stay there a lot longer, in fact, if only the pile of things he ignored weren't growing so big that it squeezed him flat from the inside till he felt like a piece of hammered shit again. He'd want you to know that, Sino would. He didn't actually mean to fuck it all up. Lesson: things you fixate on tend to get bigger, but so do things you ignore completely. The only things that get smaller are those you gently let go of as they sweep downriver and shrink to nothing in the distance. Even then, they're not actually getting smaller. You're just changing the amount of space between you. Since everything in the universe is unshakably connected to everything else, that will have to do. This is the story of a plant that grew too large and had to be repotted. The 6th part is called Fruit. Chapter 1. In his 7th year as a story fisher, Sino started to steal dreams and cut them together at home, which was illegal. Actually, since the Limfolk were a theocracy, it was technically heresy, which is similar, but with even more deranged punishment implied. The more deranged, the better, goes the logic, since the crime committed was against divinity itself. It began innocently. He'd worked his way down the ladder to the stitching house, only to find there was an even loftier nadir among the fishers, the composer. Composers, respected yet reviled, lived in monastic seclusion in a complex of secret chambers dug into major support limbs beneath the town. Rather than stitching stories together to match a pattern, a composer was free to fashion as they pleased. Patterns, after all, by their nature become stale over time, and only through restrained experimentation can new ones be developed. Sino could never hope to become a composer, not without a regime change, since rootlings were considered too dull-witted for the profession. Composers trained from birth, and there were only a handful allowed at any given time. They even had their eye stalks clipped at a ceremony as babies, blinding them. It was supposed to make them more sensitive to the vibrations of each vision, but as a veteran stitcher and someone whose duties now occasionally included describing the finer nuances of a story beat to a decrepit eyeless mantis man, Sino found himself questioning the wisdom of such a setup. Sino's poverty extended beyond the artistic, since he refused to spend any money that he earned. He ate a subsistence diet and kept living in his closet with the straw mat crowded with memories of episodes. Self-loathing was smeared all over the walls, but the price was right, so he stayed on anyway. This wasn't to expedite his ability to continue up tree, but rather because he was being fully controlled by a part of his mind that told him even this was better than he deserved. He was scared it was the corn dough kid, and even scareder that it might not be. So he stole. Okay. Perhaps it was an act of rebellion, or a wounded heart lashing out. Maybe it was a damage assessment. It was definitely several things, and he figured out what some of them were only after the sewing was complete. He'd run it through his hands and think, oh, that's what I meant. That's how I am. I see. Here's the kind of stuff Sino stitched together alone in the moonlight in his tiny room from unwanted bits saved from the cutting room floor and secreted inside a false lining in his backpack. Stories about people like him, facing the challenges he was facing. This was a way to try and model the future and guess what might happen, which was a way to be less afraid. Some of them rhymed, some of them just stood there like a wall. Stories about the past, and how he should have done something different and it would have all worked out. Lots of those ended with happily ever after, and Sino wrapping his head in straw. Stories outside himself, his own observations of people or how the world worked, stuff he'd learned. Those ones meant almost nothing to Sino. He idly fashioned them out of unused scraps, just so they wouldn't crawl away at night and expose his thought crimes. These last, it turned out, were pretty good. Better than the story you're reading now, certainly, which makes them something the author, by definition, can't adequately describe. Sino could have, though, even if he did it gracelessly, with the chaotic, caterwauling wisdom of unprocessed trauma bouncing around an echo chamber. His stuff wasn't very good yet, or clean yet, but dark and fascinating parts of his mind emerged when he placed beats by instinct, instead of according to the patterns he'd spent so many hours memorizing and immersing himself in. Sometimes he could even hide a little of his grief in the story and banish it from his body forever like a magic trick. So without knowing it, Sino developed a voice as an artist. It was just a bud, but it was there. Lesson. One nice thing about writing a lot is that you can read things you wrote 10 years ago and find obvious patterns in your thinking that you weren't aware of at the time. One crappy thing about writing is that there's nothing you can do with that information. Chapter 2. At the same time Sino was practicing art therapy without realizing it, he also found that he enjoyed talking to his peers as long as the scope of conversation was limited to their shared interest in the work. They mostly talked about stories they'd seen or heard, which Sino found comforting because no one asked about his insides. They'd hang out in a small cluster of 3 or 4 after work, eating mediocre produce and rye bread at the cul-de-sac tip of a narrow branch, just talking, until the sun set to their left behind the vertical horizon of the trunk. Sino held hands with his girlfriend and kicked his legs gently in the air. She was the only one who knew about the stack of illicit stories he kept under the floorboards with the talking rock, so she was the first one to tell him that they were pretty good. That meant a lot to Sino. Other pretty good stuff happened too. Sino wasn't mentally present for most of it, but just because you don't open a gift doesn't mean it wasn't offered. He spent more and more time feeling the undertow pull of the mission he'd been sent on, the weight of his obligation to his people and to the great tree itself. Because he felt he'd already failed, he also thought a lot about how he was probably a bad person, all in all. His secret insides were full of dreams and corn and disappointment. Still, there was some gorgeousness. Gorgeous relationships with other people are hard to reduce without sounding cheesy. To avoid that pitfall, let's just say the time passed and he mixed himself up with that place and those people, as thinking animals tend to do. He came to love both, but the people especially. 1,000 tiny moments built that love, strong as spider silk, but here are just 2. You are invited to let the fact that this lonely pair must stand in for so many moments of unspoken love render them even more poignant. In the first one, Sino is hitting himself in the head with the talking rock, but in a good way. It's good because he's doing it in front of a friend, and he's never done that before. He only hits himself once, hard, then embarrassment pulls him back from the brink. He jokes in a quiet voice that on the bright side it must mean he's finally comfortable enough to freak out in front of them. They talk for hours, saying a lot of things, the subtext of which is, I love you, I want you to be okay. Click, chitter, whistle, click they go, all night long. In the second one, his girlfriend is hugging him from behind, tight, and making the facial expression that is the limfolk equivalent of a radiant smile, awful to behold. All 3 of his friends are huddled around looking at stories Sino made, marveling at his cleverness and falling for his pretty good plot turns, laughing out loud at his jokes and choking up over his tragic downfalls. They gasp and clap at the end and ask for more. One even asks to borrow one to take home and watch again. See, I told you they were good, whispers his girlfriend, who was the one who'd mainly given him the confidence to share them. But that's how they leaked out, of course. That's how Sino did the thing he never wanted to do, which was get in trouble. Lesson. Sometimes, if you come out of hiding, you get bopped. That doesn't mean it wasn't worth it. That doesn't mean you aren't courageous and lovely. Chapter 3. Do you wish to destabilize our society? Said the fractal thing. Not at all, Your Holiness, said Sino. He's not the tree pope, I'm the tree pope, said the tree pope. Still, it was hard not to stay locked on the fractal thing, which it turned out was called the gatekeeper. The gatekeeper identified composers at birth and decided when to retire them, too. True to its name, an enormous gate stood behind it, made of a metal Sino couldn't identify. It was firmly shut, but the muffled echoes of chains doing their work occasionally emanated from within. This was the gate to the divine elevator, which serviced both those continuing up tree and those descending to take their place in the sub-sylvan chambers below. The gatekeeper had many limbs, and was the size and rough shape of one of the local spider things, except that every hair on each of its limbs was also a limb, and each hair on those limbs was also a limb, and so on. They terminated in neither hand nor foot, since they didn't terminate at all. This uncountably infinite set of appendages rippled, revealing the invisible movement of air through the cathedral chamber. The creature's exterior was void black, with a faint aura of rainbow from feeding on so many stories over the decades. Do you seek to indoctrinate our pupa in the ways of the rootling, said the gatekeeper, or are you simply the ringleader of an illegal story cell? At the center of the whirlpool interrogating Sino was a giant eyeball.
The pupil was an open hole that flexed like a mouth to give voice to the thing's thoughts. The terrible eye bore down on Sino like a spotlight, and he could see fibrous nerve tissue all the way at the back of that tunnel of vitriol. Interrogation, inquisition, trouble. Sino said. Can I say neither? Tree Pope again. You profess innocence, and yet stories with your fingerprints have been found in the hands of citizens all over town, some even copied or put on display for cadres of freaks and sinners. Perhaps the very fact that they were stitched by a primitive mind is some kind of sick appeal for these people, but I will not have it. I understand, said Sino. I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to express myself. I was just trying to not feel so bad. Look at me, shouted the Tree Pope, whose voice reminded Sino a bit of the talking rocks. Sorry, Your Holiness, he said, wrenching his gaze away from the gatekeeper and meeting that of the big guy, the head honcho. The religious leader of the limb folk was draped in tree parts, as always, weighed down with pine cones jammed between his plates and boas of woven branches. You claim to want to become a part of our society, to make a home among us, and yet you profane our ways. You attempt to rise above your station. I didn't know that's what I was doing, said Sino. A bit about the office of Tree Pope. It was the Tree Pope's most sacred duty to sniff out the clutch of eggs from which the next gatekeeper would emerge, and sing to them and chastise them in equal measure as they gestated. Then the fated one fed on its siblings and grew large. No one remembered it anymore, but this lineage were actually descended from the god of the spiders, who slowly lost their faith and language after being enslaved by limb folk. Their culture was lost completely, principally because they wrote only in webbing, believing that to seek permanence is the gravest sin of all. Nevertheless, there was a certain propinquitous force to a swirling vortex with an eyeball for a face, and most popes found themselves more than a little intimidated by their gatekeepers. No one else could operate the divine elevator, so no one dared dislodge them. Yet even as they worked to industrialize and codify, the limb folk also wondered what was up there. Dormant, neglected parts of them wanted to climb. In a way, to become Tree Pope and preach uppish was to sacrifice your faith's dearest hope. No wonder TP was irritable. We ought to round up your whole seditious gang and drag you to the silken gallows right now to put on a show, said the Tree Pope. Let's not be so hasty. Have you reviewed this contraband? The gatekeeper shifted its gaze to its eminent colleague, and its million legs drifted with and behind it like an octopus. The Tree Pope flinched. His pine cones rattled. Surely not. I'd never sully mine holy eyes with— I liked the one about the bird that shed its wings, said the gatekeeper, turning back toward Sino. What did you mean by having the young boy killed in the end? Was that representative of his lost innocence, or were you just having trouble wrapping it up? Sino said, after some silence, I don't know, really. It just seemed like the best solution out of the scraps of dream I could get my hands on. Are you saying you sanction this rudeling's behavior? Shouted TP, but a bit quieter than before. The rules will be observed, said the Eye, but he will not be killed. Instead, his stories will be confiscated and brought to me, and he will be granted license to ascend, where he will trouble us no more. Ascend? That is a sacred privilege. Said the fractal thing. But, the Pope blustered. Sino took up his sentence in the middle. But I don't want to ascend. The gatekeeper was quiet for a moment, then cuirasated all of its limbs at once. Very well, it said. Then you will be safely returned to your people to forget all you have experienced here. But only because I like you. But I can't go home either. I've failed my people completely and been gone 8 years now besides. I'm sure I'm no longer welcome there. Well, said the hideous eyeball, hanging it is then. A couple guards dragged him screaming into some kind of dungeon, and they publicly executed him the next morning, along with his 3 friends and his girlfriend. Although Sino's death was faked, the others were not, which was a real shame. Lesson: don't look a gift spider in the pupil mouth. This is the story of failing upwards. The 7th part is called Leaves. Chapter 1. After that, Sino lived in a hollow several levels below the Timber Cathedral, composing stories for the gatekeeper to eat. It turned out there were dozens like him, rootlings and limfolk both, busily cranking out food for a tamed god so it would keep the elevator running, which kept hope and faith alive in the keyholes of the people. It was possible the tree pope was unaware. Unlikely, but possible. Sino's whole world became a small, simple study. It wasn't oppressive, except that he wasn't allowed to leave. Guards brought in food and candles and emptied the chamber pot. The bed was about 10 times as comfortable as his straw mat had been, and he had all the tools he needed to make stories. The catch was, they'd never be shown to anyone, just gobbled up by the thing that kept the system going. Machines need oil, and mills need grist, whatever that is. The room smelled nicely damp. It creaked. If he hadn't been shattered by the execution of his friends to the point of total dissociation, Sino might even have found life in there tolerable. Instead, he pulled all his hair out and retched for hours a day and gibbered and drooled and left blood on the wall from banging his head. He wasn't protesting for his freedom, though, at least not from that particular prison. The prison was his body. He wanted to be as free as can be. He wanted it to have not been fake. Pretty soon, Sino stopped having episodes even, because to hit himself in the head and push against his pain was to pretend it or anything mattered, which he had recently learned was false. He couldn't be grateful for the numbness, or the stories he got/had to write, because he couldn't be anything. He couldn't afford to be anything. Lesson. A difficult thing to remember at times like this is that it's natural to feel like dying when you're wading through the worst of life's shit, but later you might not. Chapter 2. Later came another 4 years after that, which is enough time to earn a bachelor's degree from a reputable university, which means it's long enough for an education. Sino was being educated on the subject of comprehensive loss by act of God. He was uncovered. One important thing he learned during those hard years is that you do graduate, eventually. Even pain so sharp it feels cosmically important is transient, as are we, as is the cosmos. In time, so many new thoughts and memories stacked up in his brain, even repetitive ones, even when he tried to stop it, that the ones about his dead friends seemed like a movie projected from too far away. Things got a little fuzzy. Sino still would not give the movie 2 thumbs up, but a day came when he could look at it without wanting to die. Some people got hanged. He knew them. Okay. Eventually, he went days without even thinking of them, which was monstrously unfair and a mercy. When he started to forget details of their faces and bodies, he felt guilty, so he cut more keyholes in his heart shaped like each of them, as best as he could remember. He devoted himself to his work, which was being a slave, and tried to let go of both his past below and whatever imagined destiny had once lay above for him. Here was quiet, dark, and hidden. Here was good. Sino enjoyed stitching the scraps together, even if the finished pieces were destined for oblivion. Organizing his grief, pain, and insight into a sensible sequence was like connecting a cloud of dots and finding, reassuringly, that there was a picture there after all, that it did mean something. There was an underlying intelligence at work. There were reasons. Life wasn't just dots, stars, pinball, horseshoes, and hand grenades. There were rules. There was a system. Someone was listening. He found this practice healing, even if it was a lie by its nature. At least they were colorful lies. At least they carried a kernel of hope. And was it a lie, really? If you put something somewhere, isn't it there now? If you walk into chaos and place meaning there intentionally, it's real, isn't it? Everything you can imagine is real. Sino got better and better at composing stories as he did it over and over, which is all you have to do to get better at anything, from sex to genocide to the oboe. By the time he'd spent a decade among the limfolk and 4 years tucked away in a wooden cubby beneath them like a termite, the dreams he sowed went from pretty good to good. They still didn't have a ton of substance, because Sino only knew a fraction of what he would someday, but the texture was right. You couldn't see the seams anymore, and the colors flowed more freely. He could shape the story such that it would waft whichever way he wanted as it fell through the air. He learned to make them shimmer. Most of Sino's dreams were about things he had learned or feelings he'd had from interactions with his dead friends. He didn't say that directly, or even know it consciously, but it was still true. His brain and his hands were putting some of what happened into the stories, so Sino wouldn't have to hold on to it all. The gatekeeper, as stated, happily gobbled them all up, hardly pausing to chew. After dismantling 50 or so in what passed for its digestive system, it started to recognize the themes Sino liked to circle. After 100, it knew most of his patterns and tricks. After 200, it couldn't help but find them tasteless and bland. And that's how Sino got fired. Lesson: practice makes perfect, but all you can do is all you can do. Chapter 3. 2 years in, when Sino's stories still felt fresh to it, the gatekeeper, fatter than it had been in a long time, drunk on dream glow, ordered his climbing harness, clothes, and pack returned to him as a reward. Sino rummaged through his personal items in the dim, not wanting to really, making an inventory and checking it against his memory, as if to verify the materiality of his experiences. The wooden key was there, as were the diseased roots, now completely covered in an orange foam and seemingly magnetic. Sino had no idea how to interpret this. The corn dough ball was not there, because it lived inside him now, like a spy. The stone was there. Without looking at it, Sino buried it under a pile of used-up spools of thread in the bottom drawer of the wood desk with the corners sanded down for his own safety and safety of the guards. He handled the thing like a red-hot Nazi turd, but it didn't talk, and hadn't since the hanging. The last words Sino could remember hearing before being thrown into his cell were in Lim tongue. They were spoken by the guard that led him to that place. They were, "Don't worry. Once you get used to it, it's not so bad." This turned out to be true of most things Sino would encounter later in life. Another 2 years after, instead of shoving a plate through the food slot, the same guard opened the door and said the next words Sino was to hear. This time, they said, "Grab your stuff, Rootling. Time to be free again." Freedom. Now there was something Sino suspected would feel just as awful no matter how used to it he got. But since he was a slave, and since he usually did what people told him to anyway, Sino once again donned his imaginary blanket of scabs, then hugged his cloth trunk to his chest like a baby, and crawled out of the hole he'd called home. Lesson: if you really want to free yourself from an oppressor, become useless to them. Chapter 4. Sino stood before the gatekeeper once again. Its countless limbs were thick and pulsed with light that illuminated a tracery of veins. The iris of its eye had split several times, a gray-green amoeba giving birth to more of itself. A jumble of colored circles jiggled inside the white, each with its own pupil. Instead of one booming voice emanating from a central mouth, the thing now spoke in a chorus of high-pitched ones, like talking to a swarm of flies. Sino was surprised to see that it had changed, although he shouldn't have been, because everything does all the time. "We're going in another direction," it said. "No, wait, you are. We're staying here. Sorry. Now that I've imbibed so many stories, I can see things from any angle." She sometimes mixes up its point of view. "Are you trying to say I'm fired?" said Sino. "No, you are," said the gatekeeper. "Oh, wait, from your point of view, yes, I am. Anyhow, we know what they mean." "Wow," said Sino. "Fired." "Free," the thing corrected. "Oh, God, that's much worse." Sino's knees quaked. "Why? What's wrong with them?" "You mean your stories?" "Well, when it comes to that," every single one of the sentient fractal's limbs found a partner and crossed in a superior way. "You've certainly maintained your signature flair and dark humor, but a fixation on upsetting themes and inability to wrangle your own wandering attention drains the urgency out of anything you might have to say. We get it," the audience veritably screams. "You're sad. Where's the structure, the control? Is he being eclectic or scattered, poignant or maudlin? All distinction, all nuance is crushed beneath the blur of interchangeable beats and characters, once shocking and now passé. The artist may have at one time boasted a voice that stood out from the choir, but an inability to mature or evolve his thinking comes through at the plot level, leaving savvy viewers to contend with little more than a stack of telegraphs and sleeves lousy with hearts. The bag of tricks has been exhausted, the tools dulled, the twists rendered trite. In short, there's nothing to see here, folks. Move along. One must further wonder if this is really the sort of story the collective should be devoting its attention to in the modern context. Do we really need the tale of another talented male disappointed because of the perceived shortfall of his inherited largesse? Methinks it's time to put this one-trick master out to pasture, where he can safely disappear up his own ass. That was very thorough, said Sino. Well, said the gatekeeper, I've been thinking about it for a long time. So what happens now? For your service to the uppish church and the state, your criminal record has been expunged. You are welcome to continue your journey upwards toward perfection, or return to the ground and a primitive state of sin. Can't I please stay here? Infinite arms already folded, the gatekeeper shrugged a trillion shrugs, all the shrugs that have ever been shrugged or will ever be shrugged. I don't know, it said. I guess so. No one's ever asked to do that. Well, I am. You can't stay in your room, though. The slot's already filled. I'll find somewhere. If you get caught stitching stories again, there's nothing I can do for you. You'd be hanged even more emphatically than last time. I understand. And you're supposed to be dead, so you couldn't make any new friends. And you'd have to live outside town. Okay. You'll have to work to eat. I'd love to shovel shit if positions are still available. I know it's competitive. The eye didn't cry, but it did get a little glassy, which was disturbing at scale. Its irises drifted to the bottom and collected there. You know, it said, you can't stop things from changing just by standing still. Sino didn't speak. Well, okay, go on then, said his patron, jailer, god, and ex-employer. I'm done with you. His birthright was lost. His soul was lost, his people were lost, and the universe was potentially ending, but at least Sino knew where he stood now. He was well and truly settled, free to mix himself up with the place around him again and see if his wounded roots could find purchase. Maybe he'd even make another friend. Just one. Maybe they could keep it secret. Sino walked to the back of the chamber where he'd left his stuff. The only other door he could see was the one that led back to the dungeons, not counting the gate to the divine elevator, so he wasn't sure where to go. When he bent to recover his pack, the nearest wall slid aside to reveal a spiral staircase twisting up into darkness. A mothball smell drifted from the opening. As he climbed out of the sanctum, Sino's primary feeling was of relief, made sharper by a shading of guilt that clung to its edges. The guilt shadow lengthened with each step he took, so that by the time he reached the top, it had eclipsed the relief completely. Some things that he had not worried about for a while rose back to the surface like bodies in a swamp. He'd been told to go up the tree. He'd been offered the chance to go up the tree, and he had denied it. That was bad. He wasn't supposed to do that. The bad thoughts revved up and started doing laps around Sino's brain, racing each other. This woke up the talking rock, whose voice immediately resumed, energized by its years of slumber. He hadn't heard the refrain since the staticky gap in his memory that contained the murder of his friends and lover, but he knew the lyrics anyway. The other one is very far ahead of you. Sino ignored it. Lesson: you can't stop things from changing just by standing still. Chapter 5. Things only got worse from there. Sino tried to destroy the stone or drop it off a branch, but he seemed constitutionally unable to do so. He could conceptualize the act, but his brain could never organize it into a set of actionable steps, let alone transmit those instructions to the parts of his body whose cooperation was required to manifest it. He hypothesized that this was a quality of the rock itself, but had no evidence by which to test this. So, waking at dawn in his lean-to, made of long leaves bound together with discarded web, nestled in the crook of two lesser branches considered unsafe to traverse at night. The other one is very far ahead of you. Squatting at the railing by a small fire, buffeted by a cold wind pouring scalding water down his throat to wake up. The other one is very far ahead of you. Shoveling spider shit all day while the trainers mimed trade and ran simulated barter scenarios to teach their steeds how to haggle. They used straw dummies tied to wooden crosses to stand in for the rootlings, and Sino imagined he could recognize the real people some of them were based on. But this was just something nice the hopeful part of him made up. That's okay.
The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you.
Sino didn't get the joy from shoveling shit that some of his fellow students had, which made him wonder if he was anhedonic. He was white-knuckling it, just trying to get by. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. He spent all his wages on good food, but everything still tasted past its expiry compared to what he ate growing up. The limfolk caked a lot of stuff in salt, or soaked it in salt water to keep it edible longer. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. He started to feel again, and that meant the episodes came back. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. He didn't save up for a place in town. He didn't deserve one. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. He avoided other rootlings who came through. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. Soon Sino stopped being able to block out the stone. Soon it was almost all he thought about. He couldn't tell if the smell of spider shit in his nose was shit or the thought, if the stone was saying it or he was. He knew it would never give him peace as long as he ignored his duty. The guilt would drive him to his grave and, he suspected, hound him even after that. Sino's shame was a black mark that couldn't be expunged except by forgiveness, and there was no one there to forgive Sino for failing to live up to his potential and letting the great tree die. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. Arlo might have been able to at least make a forgiveness dent, but somewhere in there they got drunk together and caught up. And Sino said several very cruel things to him because he was scared of pushing him away, which pushed him away, which Sino knew it would. Aside from transactions with clerks or muttered assents to people at work, he didn't talk to anyone but the rock after that. He ate sand. He slept on splinters. He drank garbage water. He didn't want to bother anyone. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. The other one is very far ahead of you. Still, Sino refused to leave. At this point, it becomes inefficient to represent what the talking rock said as many times as it said it. Therefore, a capital X will from now on be used to denote one iteration of the other one is very far ahead of you. Lesson. Chapter 6. Lesson. Not every thought is worthy of your attention, no matter how much your brain might spit it at you. Your mind is a lotus. Your mind is a cobra. Chapter 7. He left. Lesson. IFS posits that the mind is made up of multiple parts, and underlying them is a person's core or true self. Like members of a family, a person's inner parts can take on extreme roles or even develop their own sub-personalities. Each part has its own perspective, interests, memories, and viewpoint. A core tenet of IFS is that every part has a positive intent, even if its actions are counterproductive and/or cause dysfunction. There's no need to fight with, coerce, or eliminate your parts. The IFS method promotes internal connection and harmony to bring the mind back into balance. IFS therapy aims to heal wounded parts and restore mental balance. The goal is to create cooperative and trusting relationships between the self and each part. The first step is to access the core self, and then, from there, understand the different parts in order to heal them. In the IFS model, there are 3 general types of parts. 1. Exiles represent psychological trauma, often from childhood, and they carry the pain and fear. Exiles may become isolated from the other parts and polarize the system. Managers and firefighters try to protect a person's consciousness by preventing the exile's pain from coming to awareness. 2. Managers take on a preemptive, protective role. They influence the way a person interacts with the external world, protecting the person from harm and preventing painful or traumatic experiences from flooding the person's conscious awareness. 3. Firefighters emerge when exiles break out and demand attention. They work to divert attention away from the exile's hurt and shame, which leads to impulsive and/or inappropriate behaviors like overeating, drug use, or violence. They can also distract a person from pain by excessively focusing attention on more subtle activities, such as overworking or overmedicating. Chapter 8. Once again, 11 years later, Sino donned his harness and trunk and prepared to try and climb the universe. The cloth of the trunk was worn and patched now. The leather straps of the climbing rig cracked to a degree that failed to inspire confidence. His altimeter was broken and useless, but Sino didn't care. Either he'd continue his climb and the rock would stop harassing him, or the straps would snap and he'd fall down and forget it all shortly before being pulverized into mud. Didn't matter which. He returned to an obscure nave deep in the winding halls of the timber cathedral and was surprised to find the hidden panel already slid open, bustling even. As Sinnoh attempted to descend the spiral stairs, he had to back up several times to make way for workmen carrying small pieces of furniture up and out. The gatekeeper was chained to the ground now, in obvious pain. The chains were fashioned from rings of wood studded with iron thorns. Behind it stood the gate to the divine elevator, which had opened to reveal a hollow shaft lined with the same unblemished metal the door was made of, neither iron nor bronze. This tube was the umbilical, through which the gatekeeper fed exsanguinated dreams to its masters above, and the promised path heavenward for rootlings coming of age, or limfolk on a pilgrimage. "Try not to empathize overly," came a familiar voice, more reverberant now that the space was mostly empty. "You were, after all, the catalyst for its current undergoings." Sinnoh was surprised he hadn't noticed the tree pope standing at the focal point of the gatekeeper's attention. Perhaps this was because he wore a strikingly different outfit from his official garb. It wasn't until they approached one another that Sinnoh realized they weren't clothes at all, but foamy orange fungus fringed with brown hairs that pulled this way and that as if reaching for something. Patches of the stuff covered His Holiness's body from his neckline to the soles of his tarsi, and orange tinged his spiracles and polluted the jelly at the ends of his eye stalks. When he spoke, the smell of rotten vegetables filled the space between them. The buckles on Sinnoh's climbing harness went horizontal, pointed at the Pope as if attracted magnetically. "It grew unruly on what you fed it," said the tree Pope. "The system of exchange, sacrosanct for 1,000 years, has become unbalanced. Supply chains are breaking down." "I have some roots you probably ought to look at," said Sinnoh. "The time for looking at roots is over," shouted the tree Pope. "Now comes the time of chained gods, the time of the shaft and the rise, the time to shout timber!" He put his arms out and twirled around. His mandibles chattered, saying nothing, just the gibberish the traders would babble at sea level when their minds had gone. TP didn't much remind Sinnoh of the man he'd met before. "Does the elevator still work?" Sinnoh asked. "The gatekeeper said I could use it." "Surely you can," said the tree Pope. "We've wrested control from the moneylenders and cast them down like broken boughs, and damn the cost! Up, up, little rootling, upwards to oblivion!" Okay, said Sinnoh. "Thanks." His self-pity was temporarily overtaken by fear chemicals, so he took off for the open gate without another word. He didn't even look back when he heard the floor start to creak and groan, as if something very large had just joined them in the room. The gatekeeper hissed through its chains as Sinnoh passed by. Its voice was wind on rubble now, shovels biting into a gravel pit. Sinnoh was careful to stay out of reach of even its smallest grasping limbs. "Help me," it said, it who had once been a god. "I'm sorry," was all Sinnoh said. Behind him, the sounds of more limfolk flooding the room. Shouts, fighting. "Fuck you then," the gatekeeper spat. "Your stuff was always shit. You're shit. I was just humoring you because your mom's the chief. You're a privileged dipshit with nothing to say, and your pain is cheap and flimsy. You're doomed and you should fucking kill yourself." "I know. I already know that," said Sinnoh. "I'm really, really sorry." He could see orange reflected in the thing's eyes as the crackle of flames erupted behind him. Orange foam slopped against the backs of his feet and started to infect the floorboards. In a few seconds, Sinnoh was around and behind the eye, following the wooden chains like an ocular nerve upstairs and towards the yawning gate. Inside, it was coffin black. He could tell the shaft was massive, that it had a sloped floor, and that there was a big pile of crates and canisters a couple yards in, but the rest was impossible to make out. Sinnoh's brain offered him a way to delay plunging into that terrifying darkness for one more scant second, so he took it. "Is this the fiery end my mother foresaw?" he asked the gatekeeper. "Has this decay already taken my village?" "I do know," it said, "but I'm not going to tell you." Suddenly, the magnetic charge in the room tripled. The buckles on Sinnoh's harness were yanked backward so powerfully it took all his effort just to stay in place. Blind animal panic shot through him as he leaned, feet starting to slip on the orange film. The open door of the elevator was only paces ahead, a crescendo of burning and screaming and splintering all around him. He kept his eyes closed tight. The heat of the flames reached his back and started to eat his clothes, bite into his skin. He pawed at himself. hands too stupid with terror to undo the straps and shed the climbing rig. The gatekeeper shrieked something he couldn't make out. Sino heard a new kind of tearing, close now. He braced for the feel of claws ripping his guts out, but instead felt the grasp of his rig loosen and the torn straps snake across the front of his torso as the whole thing failed and was ripped away and sucked into whatever vortex of chaos he was running from. Sino lurched forward upon release, tumbling through the gates and rolling down the slope until he banged against a crate some distance into the circular chamber and came to rest with a grunt. He ignored the stripes of pain across his shoulders and risked a glance back at the entrance. Now it was nothing but a vertical shaft of bright orange light. Thankfully, something still compelled the doors to close. They got momentarily stuck on the wooden chains, then crushed them and shut completely. Just before things went pitch black, he thought he saw burgundy blood pumping out of the severed ends. All noise from outside ceased. Somewhere above, very soft, Sino heard a new sound start, of metal on metal. It was the sound of more chains, but these ones were for moving people, not holding them in place. They caught on something and engaged, and the room shook and rumbled. Sino felt around on his hands and knees for something to steady himself on. The thing he found was warm and soft, and slithered away from his touch. The elevator began to rise. Clack, clack, clack. Lesson: chains, like most things, can be used in ways that are helpful and ways that are decidedly less so.
Oh boy, thanks for listening. Spooky. I wonder what'll happen next. Well, if you do too, you can head to patreon.com/smallbeans/shop and click on the Climb (audiobook) to begin the process of sending me $20 in exchange for the last 6 hours and change of this experience. And I hope you will. And you can find a link to that shop in the show notes as well for this episode. And we'll see you soon for the resumation of your regularly scheduled Small Beans programming. We love you.